Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing I noticed about Mrs. Whitmore's house was how it breathed. Not literally, though after 3 weeks living in her attic, I'm no longer certain about anything literal. But the old Victorian seemed to expand and contract with each gust of wind, its wooden bones creaking in rhythms that almost resembled sighs. Almost, but not quite. I'd answered her Craigslist ad out of desperation. The previous landlord had tripled my rent, and as a freelance illustrator scraping by on book covers and indie game assets, I couldn't afford much. The attic was cramped, barely tall enough for me to stand upright near the center beam. But it was clean, cheap, and came with the promise of a very quiet environment for creative work. Mrs. Whitmore herself seemed like a dream landlord, 70-ish, with silver hair always pinned in a neat bun and the kind of smile that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. She insisted I call her Eleanor, brought me fresh-baked cookies on my second day, and never once complained about the late hours I kept when deadlines loomed. The drowsiness started during my first week. I'd been working on a particularly challenging commission, a book cover featuring a woman dissolving into mist, when Eleanor knocked softly on my door. She carried a small plate of what she called midnight treats, dense honey-colored squares that smelled of cinnamon, and something I couldn't identify, something earthy and ancient. "You work too hard, dear," she'd said, her voice carrying that maternal warmth that made me miss my own grandmother. "These will help you sleep." They did. Better than any melatonin I'd ever tried. One bite, and within 20 minutes, I'd be fighting to keep my eyes open. I'd barely managed to save my work before collapsing onto the narrow bed tucked beneath the slanted roof. But the sleep felt wrong. Too deep, too dreamless. I'd wake 12 or 14 hours later feeling groggy and disoriented, as if I'd been underwater. And always, something in the room would be different. Nothing dramatic. My coffee mug moved from the desk to the windowsill. Pencils arranged in perfect parallel lines when I distinctly remembered leaving them scattered. Books turned spine inward when I was certain they'd been facing out. Small changes that I almost convinced myself were products of my own absent-mindedness. Almost. The air carried a different quality too, thick with the scent of incense. Sandalwood mixed with something sharper, more medicinal. I'd searched the room each morning but never found a source. The smell would fade by afternoon, leaving me questioning whether I'd imagined it entirely. By the third week, paranoia had begun its slow crawl up my spine. I started taking photos of my workspace before accepting Eleanor's nightly offerings, comparing them to the morning scenes. The differences were always there, subtle but undeniable. Someone was entering my room while I slept, but the door locked from the inside, and the single window was 3 stories up with no fire escape. The only access was through the main house, past Eleanor's bedroom. She'd have to let them in, but why? And who would want to rearrange a struggling artist's supplies? I considered confronting her, but Eleanor seemed so genuinely kind, so utterly innocent in her elderly routines of gardening and afternoon tea. She'd mentioned her late husband Walter with such evident grief, showing me faded photographs and telling stories about their 40-year marriage. A woman who still set 2 place settings out of habit didn't seem capable of whatever this was. The paralysis came on a Thursday. I'd been more careful with the treats, taking only small bites, fighting the drowsiness longer. Maybe that partial resistance left me conscious enough to experience what usually happened in the depths of unconsciousness. I woke, or thought I woke, unable to move, my eyes open to the familiar slanted ceiling, but my body felt encased in invisible concrete. Even breathing required enormous effort, each inhalation a conscious battle against suffocating weight. The air shimmered near the foot of my bed. At first I thought it was sleep paralysis, a condition I'd researched extensively after a college episode. The brain awakening while the body remained locked in REM sleep, often accompanied by hallucinations. But this felt different, more present, more real. The shimmer coalesced into something resembling a woman, though the boundaries kept shifting. Solid one moment, translucent the next, as if she existed between states of being. Her face was beautiful but wrong. Features too perfect, eyes too knowing, skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She leaned over me, and I felt her breath against my ear despite the obvious impossibility. When she spoke, the words seemed to come from inside my skull rather than through my ears. "I need a body to stay." The voice carried desperate hunger, ancient and patient, and utterly alien. "You're young, strong. You create beautiful things. I could make such beautiful things with your hands." I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body remained a prison. The figure traced a finger along my forehead. I felt the touch like ice burning through my skin, and continued in that internal whisper. "She painted you so well. Every detail perfect. The anchor holds, but anchors can be enhanced." Then she was gone, and I could move again. I lurched upright, gasping, heart hammering against my ribs. The room looked normal. My scattered art supplies, the easel in the corner, the single window showing pre-dawn gray. But the incense smell hung thick as fog, and my forehead burned where she'd touched me. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I installed the cameras. 3 tiny devices ordered with express shipping and my last $50. One focused on the room's interior, one on the door, one on the window. If someone was entering my space, I'd have proof. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd know. I set them up while Eleanor was at her weekly grocery run, connecting them to my laptop with motion activation software I'd pirated years ago for a client project. Then I waited. Eleanor brought treats that evening, different ones, chocolate-covered somethings that smelled of vanilla and that same unidentifiable earthiness. I accepted them with my usual grateful smile, but only pretended to eat, palming the pieces and disposing of them later in the bathroom trash. I stayed awake all night, watching the camera feeds on my laptop. Nothing happened in my room, but around 3 a.m., motion sensors picked up something else. Eleanor, dressed in a white nightgown that made her look ghostly in the infrared feed, walked through the main house toward the basement. I hadn't even known there was a basement. She'd never mentioned it, and I'd never thought to explore beyond my rented space. The cameras couldn't follow her down there, but they recorded her return an hour later. She moved differently, more upright, purposeful, as if she'd been recharged somehow. And just before she passed out of view, I could swear I saw her look directly at the camera and smile. The basement became my obsession. I spent the next day researching the house's history through online records and local newspaper archives. Built in 1894 by a successful merchant named Harrison Blackwell. Eleanor and Walter had purchased it in 1982, living there peacefully until Walter's death 3 years ago. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained the wrongness seeping through the walls. But buried in a 1987 community newsletter, I found a brief mention of Eleanor Whitmore winning first place in the annual county art fair for her remarkably lifelike portrait work. The accompanying photo showed a younger Eleanor standing beside a painting of an elderly man so realistic, he seemed ready to step from the canvas. That evening, I feigned another early bedtime after pretending to eat her latest offering, some kind of herbal square that smelled like cemetery flowers. Then I waited until I heard her descend to the basement before creeping down through the house. The basement door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling through the crack. I pressed my eye to the gap and felt my world shift. Eleanor knelt before an easel, but she wasn't alone. She spoke to someone, or something I couldn't see, her voice carrying a reverent tone I'd never heard before. "He's almost ready," she was saying. "The anchor grows stronger each night. Soon you'll have what you need." On the easel sat a painting that made my blood freeze. It was me, not a photograph or sketch, but a full portrait rendered in oils with impossible detail. Every line of my face, every stray hair, even the small scar on my chin from a childhood fall. But the eyes weren't mine. They held the same ancient hunger I'd seen in my paralyzed vision. Around the basement's walls hung dozens of other portraits, men and women of various ages, all painted with that same disturbing perfection, and all watching. Even as static images, they seemed to track my movement, their gazes following me with predatory awareness. Eleanor continued her one-sided conversation, occasionally nodding as if receiving responses. Yes, I understand. The transference must be complete before the next moon. Walter was so cooperative, but this one might resist. Walter. I studied the portraits again and found him, younger than in Eleanor's photographs, but unmistakably her late husband. His painted eyes held the same wrongness as mine. I backed away from the door, understanding flooding through me with horrible clarity. Eleanor wasn't just a sweet old widow. She was collecting people, somehow trapping them in paint and canvas. And whatever entity spoke to her wanted my body as its permanent vessel. The painting was my anchor, binding me to this place, making me susceptible to whatever was happening. Each night I'd consumed her drugged treats. Each morning I'd woken to find my possessions rearranged. The connection had grown stronger. But knowledge and escape were different things entirely. I tried to leave the next morning, claiming a family emergency, but my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but died immediately, as if something was draining its power. When I called a tow truck, they said they'd arrive within the hour, but nobody came. I called again, and the dispatcher had no record of my previous call. My phone developed strange quirks, calls dropping mid-conversation, text messages appearing hours after being sent, battery draining despite being fully charged. The outside world felt increasingly distant, filtered through layers of interference. Eleanor maintained her concerned grandmother act perfectly. When I mentioned the car trouble, she offered to drive me anywhere I needed to go, but somehow we never actually made it farther than the grocery store before I found myself back in the attic, dizzy and disoriented. The treats continued appearing outside my door, and my resistance weakened each night. The hunger that gnawed at me felt supernatural, not physical appetite, but something deeper. My hands shook when I tried to paint, my concentration scattered like leaves in wind. The entity visited my dreams now, showing me visions of what we could create together. Paintings that moved and breathed, art that captured souls and held them forever. Think of the beauty, she whispered. Think of the immortality. Your work will never fade, never be forgotten. But I'd seen Walter's portrait. I'd seen the others. Immortality as a prisoner in oil and canvas wasn't immortality at all. On my 28th night in the house, desperation drove me back to the basement. Eleanor knelt before my portrait again, but this time Walter stood beside her, not the elderly man from the photographs, but the younger version from the painting. He looked solid enough, though something in his movement suggested he wasn't entirely there. The anchor is nearly complete, Eleanor was saying. Soon she'll have a proper host, and you won't be alone anymore. Walter's painted eyes found mine through the crack in the door. For a moment, his expression shifted from that hungry blankness to something almost human. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. His mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Run. But running wasn't possible anymore. I'd waited too long, let the connection grow too strong. The painting held me like a fishhook embedded in my soul. Instead, I pushed open the door and walked into the basement. Eleanor looked up without surprise, as if she'd been expecting me. "David, dear, you should be sleeping." "I know what you're doing," I said, proud that my voice didn't shake. "I know what she wants." "Do you?" Eleanor's grandmother mask slipped slightly, revealing something colder underneath. "Do you really understand what we're offering? Eternal existence. Your art preserved forever. No more struggling, no more poverty or rejection. Just creation, pure and endless." The entity materialized beside her, more solid than during my paralyzed encounter, but still shifting between states. She was beautiful and terrible, ancient power wearing the shape of a woman. "The anchor is strong enough now," she said, her voice echoing from the painted faces surrounding us. "We can complete the transference tonight." I looked at my portrait on the easel. The eyes had changed again. They were mine now, but filled with an expression I'd never worn. Fear mixed with resignation, the look of someone who'd accepted the inevitable. "What happens to Eleanor when you don't need her anymore?" I asked. The entity smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor looked uncertain. "She has served faithfully," came the carefully neutral response. But I saw the truth in Walter's painted face. Eleanor wasn't a partner in this arrangement. She was another victim, controlled and manipulated like the rest of us. The entity had been feeding off her grief, her loneliness, using her skills to create the anchors it needed. "Eleanor," I said urgently, "when did Walter really die?" Her certainty wavered. 3 years ago, in his sleep. Peaceful. Look at his portrait. Does that look like a man who died peacefully? She turned to study Walter's painted face, the fear, the desperate plea for escape. I saw the exact moment her carefully constructed reality began to crack. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not. He was happy to stay with me. She promised he could stay." The entity's form flickered with anger. Silence. The ritual begins now. But Eleanor was already moving, her artist's eye finally seeing what she'd been blind to. She grabbed a palette knife from her supplies and lunged toward my portrait. What happened next exists outside normal description. The entity shrieked, a sound that bypassed my ears and struck directly at my brain. The painted faces on the walls writhed and twisted, their mouths opening in silent screams. Reality bent and folded, the basement becoming a place between places where physics held no meaning. Eleanor's knife struck the canvas just as the entity reached for me. Paint began to flow like blood, and I felt something tear loose inside my chest, a sensation like a rope snapping under tremendous strain. The last thing I remember clearly is falling. I woke up in a hospital room with no memory of how I'd gotten there. A concerned nurse explained that Eleanor had called 911, claiming I'd fallen down her basement stairs and hit my head. I'd been unconscious for 3 days. Eleanor visited once, looking frailer than I remembered. She spoke carefully, as if afraid of saying too much, but her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. "The painting was destroyed in the fall," she said quietly. "Completely ruined. Such a shame. It was coming along so nicely." I asked about the basement, about the other portraits, but she looked genuinely confused. As far as she knew, the basement held only storage boxes and her late husband's workshop. She'd never painted portraits of strangers. The doctors attributed my experience to a severe concussion combined with possible carbon monoxide exposure from a faulty furnace. They had reasonable explanations for everything: the hallucinations, the paranoia, the lost time. Eleanor had indeed been bringing me food, but only because she worried about my health. The treats were tested and found to contain nothing but flour, sugar, and honey. I wanted to believe their version. It would be easier, cleaner, more rational. But when I paint now, sometimes my hands move without conscious direction, creating images I don't remember planning. Faces that look almost familiar, eyes that hold too much knowledge, landscapes that exist nowhere on Earth. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch glimpses of movement in the canvas, a twitch of painted lips, a shift of painted eyes. Eleanor sold the house 3 months later and moved to Florida to live with her daughter. The new owners renovated extensively, gutting the basement and converting it to a modern recreation room. They found nothing unusual during the demolition, no hidden paintings, no evidence of the scenes I remembered so vividly. But I drive past the house sometimes, usually late at night when the rational world sleeps. The windows are always dark, but occasionally I think I see light flickering in what used to be the basement, and once, just once, I could swear I saw a figure watching from the attic window, my old room, though the house has been empty for weeks. The doctors say trauma can create incredibly vivid false memories. The mind, desperate to make sense of inexplicable events, constructs elaborate narratives to fill gaps in understanding. They're probably right. Probably. But I've stopped accepting food from strangers, and I never paint self-portraits anymore. Some anchors, once broken, should never be repaired. Story 2. The notification chimed at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the blue glow of my monitor where lines of code had been blurring together for the past 3 hours. Jam Session, the app I downloaded on a whim after seeing too many ads promising real musical connections, rarely produced anything worthwhile. Most matches were wannabe influencers looking for followers or middle-aged divorcees convinced they were the next Kurt Cobain. But this message was different. Outdoor rehearsal tomorrow night. Victorian mansion on Elmwood Hill. Looking for someone who understands the deeper rhythms. Can you hear what others can't? No profile picture, no name, just coordinates and a time, midnight. I should have deleted it. Should have gone to bed and forgotten about the strange pull those words created in my chest, like a tuning fork struck against my ribs. Instead, I found myself researching the location, discovering the Blackwood estate had been abandoned since 1987 when the last heir disappeared without explanation. The property records showed decades of failed sales, prospective buyers backing out after brief visits, citing atmospheric concerns and structural instabilities. The next evening found me driving up the winding hill road, my Honda's headlights cutting through fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The mansion emerged from the mist like something born from fever dreams. 3 stories of weathered Victorian grandeur, its gabled roof piercing the low-hanging clouds. Gothic windows stared down with the hollow intensity of empty eye sockets. I parked beside a rusted gate that hung open on broken hinges. No other cars. No signs of the supposed rehearsal. The silence felt thick enough to swim through, broken only by the distant creaking of old wood settling into itself. My phone showed no signal. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond its threshold. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the oppressive quiet. No response came, but as I stood there considering my options, I heard it. Faint musical notes drifting from somewhere deep within the house. A melody I couldn't quite place, played on instruments I couldn't identify. The sound seemed to move through the walls themselves, as if the building's bones were resonating with some ancient song. I stepped inside. The foyer stretched before me, grand staircase spiraling upward into shadow. Dust motes danced in the weak moonlight filtering through grimy windows, and the air tasted of neglect and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The music continued, louder now but still maddeningly distant. It seemed to come from every direction at once, as if the house itself were singing. Following the sound led me down a corridor lined with portraits whose eyes had been scratched out by time or vandals. The wooden floor groaned under my weight, each step producing a note that almost harmonized with the phantom orchestra ahead. As I walked, I noticed the doors I passed clicking shut behind me with soft, decisive sounds that raised the hair on my neck. The melody grew more complex as I progressed deeper into the mansion's bowels. What had started as a simple, almost beautiful tune began to warp and distort. The notes stretched like taffy, becoming discordant and wrong. It was as if someone were playing the instruments underwater, or in a space where sound itself obeyed different laws. The effect made my teeth ache and set my vision swimming. I reached a set of double doors at the corridor's end. The music was strongest here, though it had become so twisted that calling it music felt like a generous description. It sounded more like the dying gasps of melody itself, strangled and corrupted beyond recognition. My hand hesitated on the ornate brass handle, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't. The sound had wrapped itself around something deep in my brain, a fishhook sunk into gray matter, pulling me forward with invisible line. The doors opened onto a vast ballroom. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a scene that made my sanity waver like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. Sheet music lay scattered across the floor, hundreds of pages covered in notes written in what looked like rust-colored ink. The smell hit me then, metallic and sharp, confirming my suspicions about that ink's true nature. But it was the figures that made my breath catch in my throat. They stood throughout the room in formation, translucent shapes that flickered like old film footage. Men and women in formal evening wear from another era, holding instruments that gleamed with spectral light. Violins without strings, trumpets with no valves, a grand piano whose keys moved without sound, played by fingers I could see through. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, one of the figures turned toward me. Its face was a blur of features that wouldn't hold still, constantly shifting between expressions of joy and agony. It raised what might have been a conductor's baton, and the phantom orchestra began to play with renewed intensity. The music hit me like a physical force, driving me to my knees among the scattered sheet music. The notes I could see on the pages around me seemed to writhe and dance, rearranging themselves into messages that burned themselves into my vision. New conductor needed flesh to guide the endless song, join the eternal rehearsal. My hands shook as I grabbed the nearest page, trying to understand what I was seeing. The musical notation was wrong. Notes hung between lines that shouldn't exist, time signatures that defied mathematical possibility. Yet somehow, looking at them, I could hear how they should sound. My mind filled with the proper melody, the one these spectral musicians were murdering with their performance. The ghostly conductor raised its baton higher, and the music reached a crescendo that felt like nails on the inside of my skull. The phantom figures began to move toward me, their instruments raised like weapons. I realized with crystalline clarity that they wanted me to join them, to take up the baton and lead their corrupted symphony for eternity. But something in those rust-stained notes called to me differently. Looking closer at the scattered pages, I saw that some contained the same melody written in reverse, mirror images of the haunting tune that had drawn me here. My musician's ear, dormant since high school but never fully silenced, recognized the mathematical beauty of inversion. If the music was a trap, then perhaps its opposite was the key. I snatched up pages of the inverted notation, my movements frantic as the spectral orchestra closed in around me. Their faces, what I could make out of them, showed expressions of desperate hunger. The conductor's baton pointed directly at my heart, and I felt something cold and invasive probing at the edges of my consciousness. Standing on unsteady legs, I began to hum the inverted melody. The effect was immediate and startling. The phantom figures wavered like smoke in wind, their forms becoming even more translucent. The oppressive weight of the original song lifted slightly from my shoulders, but humming wasn't enough. I needed to conduct. Fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I raised my right hand and began to move it in the patterns I remembered from high school band class. Left to right instead of right to left. Down beats where up beats should be. Everything backwards, everything wrong made right. The ghostly orchestra began to fade with each gesture. Their instruments flickered like dying light bulbs, and their forms stretched thin as gossamer. The conductor fought against my counter-melody, its baton cutting angry slashes through the air, but my inverted song was unraveling whatever force held them together. As the last spectral figure dissolved into moonlight and shadow, the ballroom fell silent. The scattered sheet music crumbled to dust at my feet, leaving only the faint metallic scent of old blood and the echo of my ragged breathing. I ran then, through corridors that seemed longer than before, past doors that now stood open as if the house itself were exhaling. The front entrance appeared ahead like salvation, and I burst through it into the cool night air. My car started on the first try. I drove down the hill with shaking hands, not looking back until I reached the main road. In my rearview mirror, the mansion stood silent and dark, showing no signs of the supernatural orchestra that had tried to claim me. It wasn't until I was safely home, sitting in my own living room with every light blazing, that I began to question what I'd experienced. Had it been real? The app showed no record of the message that had lured me there. No profile, no conversation history. My phone's GPS had no log of the drive to Elmwood Hill, but my clothes smelled of dust and decay. My fingernails were dirty with grime that looked suspiciously like the rust-colored stains I'd seen on those phantom sheet music pages. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I can still hear that twisted melody playing somewhere in the distance. The rational part of my mind, the programmer's brain that deals in logic and code, insists it was a hallucination. Stress-induced psychosis brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. The mansion was probably just an empty building where my overwrought imagination ran wild. But last night, I downloaded a different music app, and this morning I found myself humming a song I don't remember learning. A beautiful, haunting melody that sounds almost familiar, like something I once heard played backwards. I've been fighting the urge to search for that melody online, to see if I can find its origin. Because somewhere deep in my bones, I know that if I ever hear it played the right way around, I'll have to go back to that ballroom and pick up the conductor's baton. And this time, I might not remember how to make the music stop. Story 3. The fluorescent lights in the office had been flickering all day, casting intermittent shadows that danced across my desk like restless spirits. By the time I finally locked up the marketing firm at 11 p.m., my eyes felt raw from squinting at spreadsheets under the stuttering illumination. The October air bit through my jacket as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and I pulled my collar higher against the wind that seemed to carry whispers from the empty storefronts. I'd been walking this route home for 3 months now, ever since my car had been totaled in what the insurance company had diplomatically called an incident. The late hours came with the territory of being the lowest rung on the corporate ladder, and I'd grown accustomed to the solitary trek through downtown's arteries when they'd been drained of life for the night. Street lamps punctuated the darkness in irregular intervals, some functioning with steady amber glows, others flickering like dying heartbeats, and a few completely dead, leaving pools of shadow that seemed deeper than they should be. It was during one of those stretches between working lights that I first noticed something was wrong. My shadow, cast long and distorted by the lamp behind me, wasn't keeping pace. The realization crept over me gradually, like cold water seeping through fabric. I'd taken several steps before the dark silhouette on the asphalt caught up, lagging behind by what felt like a full second. I stopped walking and watched my shadow continue forward, then halt a moment later, as if it were mimicking me from memory rather than following in real time. The rational part of my mind immediately began constructing explanations. Fatigue, eye strain from the office lights. Maybe the angle of the street lamp was creating some kind of optical illusion. I rubbed my eyes and shook my head, the way you do when trying to dislodge water from your ear. But when I looked down again, the delay persisted. I experimented, raising my arm. The shadow arm lifted a beat later. I waved, and the shadow waved back with noticeable lag, like a video call with poor connection. A chill that had nothing to do with the October wind crawled up my spine and settled at the base of my skull. The sound of footsteps echoing off the empty storefronts made me look up. A young woman was walking toward me from the opposite direction, her silhouette backlit by a functioning street lamp about 50 yards away. She moved with the quick, purposeful stride of someone who didn't want to be out here any longer than necessary. Her shadow stretched long in front of her, reaching toward me across the asphalt like a dark finger. But there was another shadow beside hers. This second silhouette was taller, more angular, and it moved with a predatory fluidity that made my stomach clench. Most unsettling of all, it appeared to be holding something, a long, thin object that caught the light in a way that suggested metal. A blade. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things, but the shadow remained. The woman herself was alone, no one walking beside her, yet her shadow had company, and as she drew closer, I could see that her shadow, like mine, was lagging behind her movements by approximately a second. The woman noticed me watching her and her pace quickened. She was maybe 25, with the kind of determined expression worn by people who'd learned not to make eye contact with strangers on empty streets. She clutched a messenger bag against her side and kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself ready to run. I wanted to call out to her, to warn her about the armed shadow stalking alongside her own. But what would I say? That shadows were behaving strangely? That I was seeing things that couldn't possibly be there? She'd think I was crazy, and maybe I was. Maybe the long hours and stress had finally caught up with me. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown right here on the empty street. But the blade shadow was raising its weapon. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, The elongated silhouette lifted the thin object above what would be the woman's shadow head, positioning it like an executioner preparing to strike. The woman herself showed no awareness of the threat, continuing her brisk walk toward the intersection ahead, where several functioning street lamps created a pool of relative brightness. My mind raced through possibilities, each more absurd than the last. If this was real, if shadows could somehow exist independently of their casters, then what did that mean? What were they? What did they want? The answer came to me with the horrible clarity of absolute certainty. They wanted her. Somehow these shadow entities were harvesting people, separating them from their own reflections, their own dark selves. And once that connection was severed, I couldn't complete the thought. I didn't want to know what happened to someone separated from their shadow. The woman was perhaps 20 feet away now, close enough that I could see the worry lines around her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the darker stretches of street ahead. Her shadow continued its delayed mimicry, and beside it the armed silhouette prepared to strike. Without thinking, I stepped sideways into the circle of light cast by a nearby street lamp, one of the functional ones. The effect was immediate. My shadow snapped back into synchronization, moving in perfect time with my body. The delay vanished as if it had never existed. Light. The shadows were somehow disconnected in the darkness, but direct illumination forced them back into alignment. I looked at the woman's shadows again and noticed something I'd missed before. She was walking through areas where the street lamps were either broken or flickering weakly. In the patches of stronger light, her shadow moved normally. But in the dimmer areas, the lag returned, and with it, her unwelcome companion. The armed shadow was positioning itself for a strike. I had to act. Social awkwardness and fear of appearing insane suddenly seemed like trivial concerns compared to whatever was about to happen. I stepped forward, directly into the woman's path. She stopped abruptly, clutching her bag tighter. Her eyes were wide with alarm, and I realized how I must look. A strange man emerging from the shadows to block her way on an empty street at 11 p.m. "The lights," I said, my voice hoarse with urgency. "You need to stay in the lights." She took a step back, her gaze darting around for escape routes. I could practically see her calculating whether she could outrun me, whether her phone was easily accessible, whether anyone would hear her if she screamed. "I know how this sounds," I continued, raising my hands in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "But look at your shadow. Look at it carefully." Despite her obvious fear, curiosity won out. She glanced down at the asphalt and I saw her expression change as she noticed the delay, the way her shadow seemed to be following orders from a different source. "What?" she started to say, but the word died as she saw the second silhouette beside her own. The armed figure was raising its weapon higher, preparing for a downward strike. "Move toward the intersection," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "The bright lights. Don't stop in any dark patches." She looked at me as if I'd lost my mind, which was entirely possible, but she also looked at her shadow again and saw what I was seeing. The delay, the companion, the blade. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare choreographed in slow motion. The woman began moving toward the intersection, but she moved too quickly, panic overtaking caution. She stumbled into a patch of deeper shadow between two broken street lamps, and immediately her shadow's delay increased to several seconds. The armed silhouette beside her raised its weapon to full extension. I lunged forward, not toward her, but toward the nearest functioning street lamp. My hands found the metal base and I began shaking it, causing the light to flicker erratically. Each flutter of illumination seemed to disrupt the shadow entities, making them waver and lose cohesion. The woman understood instinctively. She began moving in a zigzag pattern, seeking out every pool of light, no matter how weak. I followed her lead, using my body to cast shadows that would interrupt the line of sight between the blade wielder and her dark reflection. But the entities were learning, adapting. I could see them moving independently now, not just as delayed reflections, but as autonomous beings using the darkness as their medium. They flowed between patches of shadow like liquid, maintaining their pursuit even when separated from their supposed casters. The intersection was maybe 30 yards away, blazing with the combined light of 4 working street lamps plus the illuminated signs of an all-night diner. and a 24-hour pharmacy. It looked like salvation, like a bright harbor in an ocean of threatening darkness. The woman was running now, her bag bouncing against her hip as she sprinted toward safety. I ran behind her, staying in the light as much as possible, watching our shadows snap in and out of synchronization as we moved through patches of varying illumination. Behind us I could sense rather than see a larger presence. More shadows, emerging from doorways and alleys, flowing like oil across the asphalt. The entities weren't just hunting individuals. They were coordinating, working together in some kind of harvest. We reached the edge of the intersection's bright zone, and I thought we'd made it. The woman stumbled into the pool of light, and immediately her shadow returned to normal behavior, moving in perfect sync with her body. The armed silhouette simply vanished, unable to exist in the direct illumination. But as I prepared to follow her into safety, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. I turned and saw my own shadow, the one I'd thought was safely synchronized, reaching toward me with elongated arms. It wasn't my shadow at all. It was something else, something that had been wearing my reflection like a mask. The realization hit me like ice water. The delay I'd noticed wasn't a malfunction. It was an incubation period. The entities needed time to properly inhabit a shadow, to learn its movements and mannerisms before taking control. I threw myself forward into the intersection's brightness, feeling those cold fingers brush my spine as I escaped their grasp. The woman was standing in the center of the light, breathing heavily, staring at me with a mixture of gratitude and terror. We stood there for several minutes, both afraid to move, watching the shadows at the edge of the light. They writhed and shifted, testing the boundaries of the illumination but unable to penetrate it. Occasionally, I thought I could see faces in the dark shapes, human faces twisted with hunger and desperation. Eventually, the shadows began to recede, flowing back into the alleys and doorways like a tide returning to the sea. The woman and I remained in our circle of light, neither of us speaking, both afraid that acknowledging what had happened would somehow make it more real. When the first police car arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by the diner's night manager who'd noticed two people standing motionless in the intersection, we tried to explain what had happened. The officers were professional and patient, but I could see the look that passed between them. Two stressed-out office workers having some kind of shared psychotic episode. They offered to drive us home, suggested we might want to talk to someone, left their cards with the numbers of crisis counselors. The woman, Sarah, I learned, and I exchanged contact information before going our separate ways. We met for coffee 2 days later, both of us hoping the other would admit it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But we both remembered the same details: the delayed shadows, the armed silhouette, the way the darkness had seemed alive with hunting things. Over the following weeks, I found myself taking different routes home, sticking to well-lit streets, avoiding areas where the street lamps were broken or flickering. I started carrying a small flashlight in my pocket, testing it obsessively to make sure the batteries were fresh. Sarah reported similar behavior. She'd moved to a different apartment, one closer to her university, with better lighting around the building. She'd started taking taxis instead of walking at night, despite the expense. We began meeting regularly, comparing notes, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. We researched folklore about shadows, read accounts of people who claimed to have lost their reflections, investigated urban legends about entities that harvested human essences. But the more we researched, the more we began to doubt ourselves. Every rational explanation seemed more plausible than the alternative. Stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty building ventilation, shared psychogenic illness triggered by suggestion and fear. 3 months later, I was promoted to a day shift position. The official reason was my improved performance and dedication, but I suspected my supervisor had noticed my increasingly erratic behavior around anything involving shadows or poor lighting. I still walk home sometimes, usually in daylight now, but occasionally in the early evening when the sun is setting and the street lamps are just beginning to flicker on. I pay attention to my shadow, checking its timing, making sure it moves when I move. Most of the time it does, but sometimes In those twilight moments when day surrenders to night and the lighting is uncertain, I notice the delay returning. Just a fraction of a second at first, barely perceptible. And in those moments, I remember the cold touch on my neck, the sense of something wearing my reflection like a stolen coat. Sarah and I still meet for coffee once a week. We talk about normal things now: work, weather, movies we've seen. We don't discuss shadows anymore, or entities that harvest lonely people in the darkness. We've both agreed it's healthier to move on, to accept the rational explanations. But I notice she always sits with her back to the window, and she never stays past sunset. And when we say goodbye in the parking lot, we both check our shadows before getting into our cars, making sure they're still moving in sync. Because the alternative, that we imagined it all, that we shared some kind of elaborate delusion, is almost more terrifying than the possibility that it was real. Almost. Last week I saw a news report about a woman found wandering downtown at 3 a.m., confused and disoriented, claiming she couldn't remember the last 6 hours. The reporter mentioned she kept insisting that her shadow was wrong somehow, but doctors attributed this to a possible concussion from a fall. I looked at the surveillance footage they showed on the news. In the grainy black and white image, the woman was walking down a dimly lit street, and for just a moment, it looked like her shadow was lagging behind her by about a second. But that could have been a trick of the camera, a delay in the feed, an artifact of the recording process. It probably was. I tell myself this every night as I check the locks on my doors and test the batteries in my flashlight. It probably was. Story 4. The whiskey still burned my throat when I stumbled out of Jake's party, the campus spinning like a broken carnival ride. 3 a.m., and the autumn air bit through my flannel shirt, sobering me just enough to realize I'd missed the last shuttle back to Henderson Hall. The dorm loomed 2 miles away across dark farmland, and my phone showed no signal bars. Just that mocking no-service message that seemed to mock every poor decision I'd made since orientation week. That's when I heard the diesel engine rumbling down County Road 47. The semi's headlights swept across me like searchlights, and I stuck out my thumb without thinking. The air brakes hissed as the rig pulled over, chrome exhaust stacks gleaming in the moonlight. The cab sat high enough that I had to grab the door handle and haul myself up, muscles still unsteady from the alcohol. The driver looked exactly like Central Casting would order for generic trucker. Weathered face, baseball cap pulled low, flannel shirt stretched over a modest gut. He smelled of coffee and cigarettes, familiar and comforting after the chaos of the party. "Where you headed, son?" "Henderson Hall, the college dorms. It's just a couple miles down 47. He nodded and put the truck in gear. "Know it well. Used to make deliveries there all the time." The cab felt warm and safe after the cold night air. I settled into the passenger seat, grateful to be off my feet. The dashboard glowed with an array of switches and gauges that seemed more complex than airplane cockpits, and everything had that lived-in quality of a space that served as both workplace and second home. Air fresheners shaped like pine trees hung from the rearview mirror, and empty coffee cups clustered around the CB radio. "Thanks for stopping," I said. "I owe you one." "No trouble. Roads can be dangerous this time of night." He reached over and turned up the radio. Static filled the cab before resolving into a clear voice. "Traffic report for the Tri-County area. Accident on Interstate 78 westbound at mile marker 43 has been cleared. Bridge construction on Route 15 continues to cause delays. This is WKRP with your overnight traffic update." Nothing unusual there except something felt off about the announcer's voice. Too formal, like radio personalities from old movies. I blamed the whiskey and let my head fall back against the headrest. "Construction on 15's been going on forever," I mumbled. "Some things never change," the driver agreed. The truck's engine settled into a steady rhythm as we rolled through the darkness. Outside the passenger window, empty fields stretched toward distant tree lines, broken occasionally by farmhouses with darkened windows. The cab's warmth and the engine's vibration made my eyelids heavy, but something kept me from drifting off completely. Maybe it was the way the radio kept playing those traffic reports, the same formal tone, the same careful pronunciation that reminded me of news anchors from decades past. Traffic update for Friday evening, October 13th. Fog advisory remains in effect for routes 47, 78, and 302. Visibility reduced to less than a quarter mile in rural areas. Motorists are advised to reduce speed and use extreme caution. This is WKRP, your source for overnight traffic information. Friday the 13th. I tried to remember what day it was, but the alcohol made everything fuzzy. Had Jake's party been on a Friday? The days had blurred together since midterms started. Radio's got the date wrong, I said. The driver glanced at the dashboard clock. Does it? I squinted at the digital display, but the numbers seemed to swim in the green glow. Maybe I'd had more to drink than I thought. Through the windshield, the road looked different than I remembered. Narrower, with older-style reflectors that cast yellow light instead of the bright white markers I was used to. The asphalt itself seemed different too, rougher, with the kind of worn texture that spoke of decades without resurfacing. "How long have you been driving this route?" I asked. "Long time. Since before you were born, I'd guess." The radio crackled again. Weather Service has issued a travel advisory for the following counties: Bradford, Sullivan, and Wyoming. Dense fog and unseasonably cold temperatures. Current conditions show 38 degrees with visibility less than 50 yards. This is your overnight traffic report from WKRP. That announcer's voice bothered me more with each report. It had the crisp, authoritative tone of broadcasters from old television shows, back when every word was carefully enunciated and professional standards meant something different. Modern radio personalities were more casual, more conversational. This sounded like... "When was this recorded?" I asked. "What's that?" "The traffic report. It sounds old." The driver's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Radio picks up strange signals sometimes. Atmospheric conditions bounce transmissions around." That explanation should have satisfied me, but my mind kept picking at it like a loose thread. I stared out at the roadside, trying to orient myself. We should have passed the Miller farm by now, with its distinctive red barn and grain silos. Instead, I saw only empty fields and occasional structures I didn't recognize. A gas station with pumps that looked decades out of date. A diner with neon signs in cursive script. A motor lodge with individual cabins instead of the modern chain hotels that dotted the area. "Is this still 47? I asked. "Sure is. Roads looked the same for years." But it hadn't. I'd driven this route dozens of times since starting college, and none of these buildings were familiar. The Shell station should have given way to a newer BP by now, and that diner, I was certain there'd been a McDonald's on that corner since the 80s. The radio continued its pattern. Traffic conditions remain stable on major routes. Interstate 78 shows normal flow. Route 47 clear of incidents. Current temperature 36 degrees. This has been your traffic update from WKRP, serving the Tri-County area since 1961. Since 1961, the phrase stuck in my mind like a splinter. I found myself studying everything with new attention. The radio's analog dials instead of digital displays, the manual window cranks, the absence of modern safety features I took for granted. Even the truck's interior design seemed frozen in an earlier era, all brown vinyl and brushed metal trim. "Nice truck," I said carefully. "What year?" 78 Kenworth. Built to last. 1978. The same year those traffic reports seemed to be broadcasting from. Coincidence, maybe, but my skin began to crawl with the uncomfortable feeling that I was missing something important. The alcohol fog in my head was clearing, replaced by a sharp awareness that made every detail seem significant. We passed a road sign, green metal with white letters, but the reflective coating looked dull and aged. "Millbrook 15 miles, it read. I'd never heard of Millbrook, and I'd grown up in this area. My family had lived here for 3 generations, and I thought I knew every town within 50 miles. "Where's Millbrook?" I asked. "Used to be a nice little place, farming community. Most folks moved on years ago." Used to be, past tense, as if the town no longer existed. Another sign flashed past. "Cedar Valley, 8 miles. another name I didn't recognize. The familiar landmarks of my childhood, the water tower with graffiti from my high school class, the crossroads where Route 47 met County Road 12, had vanished, replaced by intersections and structures that felt simultaneously foreign and oddly nostalgic. The radio's next update sent ice water through my veins. Final traffic report for the evening. All routes remain clear. Fog advisories will continue through dawn. Temperature holding steady at 34 degrees. Time is now 3:47 a.m., Friday, October 13th, 1978. This is WKRP signing off until morning, 1978. My hands started shaking. I pressed them against my jeans to hide the tremor, but my voice came out strained anyway. Did that radio just say 1978? The driver's profile remained impassive. Old recordings sometimes get mixed in with the broadcast. Happens more than you'd think. But the announcer had given the current time, 3:47 a.m., and when I checked my phone, despite the no-service message, the clock read exactly 3:47. The date showed Friday, October 13th, but the year on my phone showed 2023, but the numbers seemed to flicker and blur when I stared at them directly. "I need to get out," I said. "Almost there. Just past the next bend." Through the windshield, I saw we were approaching a curve I didn't remember. The road had been straight through this section for as long as I could recall, but now it curved sharply to the left, flanked by thick woods that seemed to press closer to the asphalt than physics should allow. "This isn't right," I said, louder this time. "This road doesn't curve here." "Roads change, son. Time changes everything." The truck slowed as we entered the curve, and through the trees, I glimpsed something that made my breath catch. Warm yellow light filtering through branches, the kind of soft glow that came from oil lamps rather than electric bulbs. As we rounded the bend completely, the source became visible. A large wooden structure set back from the road, its weathered boards illuminated by what had to be dozens of lanterns hanging from the eaves and corners. "There we go," the driver said with satisfaction. "The cellar. Been making deliveries here longer than I can remember." He pulled the truck into a gravel driveway that I was absolutely certain hadn't existed an hour ago. The building ahead wasn't a dorm. It was an enormous barn, the kind built for storing hay and equipment, with massive sliding doors and a gambrel roof that disappeared into darkness above the lantern light. "This isn't Henderson Hall," I said. "Course not. That's tomorrow's delivery." Tomorrow's delivery. The phrase didn't make sense, but nothing had made sense since I'd climbed into the cab. I watched the driver shut off the engine, and the sudden silence felt oppressive after the steady rumble of the diesel. Even the radio had gone quiet. No static, no traffic reports, just an empty electronic whisper. "Come on," the driver said. "Lot to see inside." Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the truck, to demand he turn around and take me back to campus, to anything that resembled the world I knew. But when I tried the door handle, it wouldn't budge. Not locked, simply immovable, as if the metal had fused into a single piece. "Door sticks sometimes," the driver said. "Easier to go through the barn." He climbed out on his side, and after a moment's hesitation, I slid across the bench seat and followed. The gravel crunched under my feet with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. Up close, the barn looked even older. Thick posts and beams that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when buildings were meant to last centuries. The lanterns cast shifting shadows that made the structure seem to breathe. The driver approached the massive sliding door and pulled it open with surprising ease. Warm air flowed out, carrying scents of hay and old wood. But underneath those familiar smells lurked something else, a metallic tang that raised the hair on my arms. "After you," he said. I stepped through the doorway and immediately understood that this place operated under different rules than the world outside. The barn's interior stretched far beyond what the external dimensions could possibly contain. Instead of the expected hay bales and farm equipment, the space held something that defied every assumption about physics and reality I'd ever held. Objects floated in slow, lazy spirals throughout the vast interior, not suspended by strings or wires, but genuinely hanging in midair as if gravity had forgotten to affect them. Hundreds of items drifted in overlapping orbital patterns. Wristwatches traced graceful arcs through the lantern light, their faces catching and reflecting the flame. Wallets tumbled end over end in stately rotations, leather surfaces worn smooth by handling. Photographs spun like autumn leaves, but instead of falling, they rose and fell in complex helical patterns that somehow never brought them into collision with each other. I recognized some of the objects immediately, not the specific items, but their types and eras. A class ring from the 1960s, its stone dark with age. A keychain with a Polaroid photo of a young couple in bell-bottom jeans. A pocket watch that had probably belonged to someone's grandfather. A backpack with patches from bands I'd never heard of but whose logos looked familiar from vintage t-shirt shops. Lost things, the driver said behind me. People drop them, leave them behind, forget where they put them. Eventually, they all find their way here. As my eyes adjusted to the warm lantern light, I began to see patterns in the floating objects. They weren't moving randomly. Each item followed a specific trajectory, and those trajectories formed larger patterns that resembled maps or routes. The path of a pocket watch corresponded roughly to the curve of Route 47, while a cluster of photographs traced what might have been Interstate 78. What is this place? Collection point. Final destination. Things that get lost on the roads need somewhere to go. I took a step deeper into the barn and immediately felt a strange tugging sensation, as if invisible threads were trying to pull something from my pockets. My wallet, I could feel it shifting against my hip, straining against the fabric. My phone vibrated once, then went completely dead, its screen fading to black. People too, the driver continued. Sometimes folks take a wrong turn, accept a ride from the wrong person, make a choice that pulls them off their intended path. Those people need somewhere to go as well. A chill ran down my spine as I understood what he was implying. The students who disappeared, the missing persons reports. Not disappeared, delayed, still making their deliveries, just on a different schedule. I thought of the campus rumors, students who'd vanished without trace, whose cars were found abandoned on rural roads with no sign of struggle or explanation. The official reports blamed everything from voluntary departure to foul play, but no bodies were ever found, no ransom demands ever made. They'd simply stepped out of the present and into somewhere else. "You're not really a truck driver," I said. "I drive trucks, have been since 1978. Same route, same schedule, same deliveries." He gestured toward the floating objects. "These all need to get where they're going eventually. Just takes longer than expected sometimes." The tugging sensation grew stronger, and I felt my student ID card sliding upward in my breast pocket. If it joined the orbital dance of lost objects, I suspected I'd be joining them permanently. Around me, the items continued their stately revolution, and I began to notice that some of them glowed with their own faint light, not reflected lantern flame, but an inner radiance that suggested they were somehow more than mere physical objects. "How do I get back?" I asked. "Same way everyone does. Find something that still belongs to you, something that hasn't been claimed by the collection. Use it to remember which direction you're supposed to be going." I frantically patted my pockets, wallet straining to escape, phone dead and cold, student ID sliding inexorably upward. Keys. Where were my keys? I'd left them in my dorm room, hadn't needed them for the party. What else did I have? Then I felt it. A small, hard object in my back pocket that I'd forgotten about completely. A guitar pick, black plastic worn smooth by years of use. I'd carried it since high school, long before I'd ever owned a guitar. More superstition than practical tool. My thumb had rubbed the surface smooth during nervous moments, and the edges were rounded from constant handling. The pick felt warm in my fingers, and when I pulled it out, it didn't try to float away. It remained solidly in my grasp, anchored to me by years of habit and memory. "That'll do," the driver said with approval. "Something with enough history to remember where it belongs." I gripped the pick tighter. "What now?" "Now you choose. Stay and help with deliveries, or take the last ride back to your regularly scheduled timeline. But choose quick. Dawn's coming, and the collection gets stronger with daylight. Through the barn's windows, I could see the eastern sky beginning to lighten. The floating objects moved faster now, their orbits tightening into more compact spirals. Whatever force controlled this place was preparing for something. "The truck," I said. "It still runs?" "Always runs. Question is whether you can find the right road back." We walked back to the semi, and this time the passenger door opened easily. The driver climbed behind the wheel and started the engine, which turned over with the same reliable rumble as before. But when we pulled out of the barn's driveway, the road looked different again, newer somehow, with fresh yellow lines and modern reflectors. "Radio might help," the driver suggested. I reached for the dial and static filled the cab before resolving into a familiar voice. "Traffic moving smoothly on all major routes. Current time is 4:15 a.m., Saturday, October 14th, 2023. You're listening to K-Rock, your overnight companion." 2023, the correct year, the correct date. "Almost there," the driver said. Through the windshield I could see lights ahead. The familiar glow of campus, with Henderson Hall's distinctive tower silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. The truck slowed as we approached the dormitory, and I realized I was gripping the guitar pick so tightly that its edges had left marks in my palm. "This is your stop," the driver said. I climbed out of the cab, legs unsteady on the familiar pavement. When I turned to thank him, the words died in my throat. The truck was already pulling away, but in the growing light, I could see that its license plate was covered with decades of rust and road grime. The chrome exhaust stacks that had gleamed in the darkness were now dull and weathered, and the trailer bore the faded logo of a company I was certain had gone out of business before I was born. By the time I reached the dorm's front door, the truck had disappeared around a corner. I fumbled for my student ID to swipe the lock, then remembered it had nearly floated away in the barn. But when I checked my pocket, there it was, exactly where it should be, as if it had never moved. My phone showed 15 missed calls from friends worried about my disappearance, all time-stamped within the last hour. According to the campus security logs I checked later, I'd been recorded leaving Jake's party at 3:07 a.m. and returning to Henderson Hall at 4:18 a.m., a round trip that should have taken 20 minutes, but had somehow consumed over an hour. The guitar pick is still in my pocket. I check for it dozens of times each day, running my thumb across its worn surface and feeling the tiny grooves left by years of nervous handling. It's solid and real, and undeniably mine, and as long as I can feel it there, I can convince myself that I found my way back to the right timeline. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone on rural roads, I catch traffic reports on distant radio stations that sound too formal, too precisely enunciated. The announcers give dates that don't quite match, mention towns that aren't on any map I can find, issue weather advisories for conditions that don't exist. And sometimes I wonder if I really made it back at all, or if I'm still making deliveries on a route that exists just slightly to the left of reality, carrying cargo that consists of my own memories and assumptions about which world is supposed to be real. The guitar pick feels solid enough, but then again, so does everything else. The dorm room, the classes, the friends who insist they remember exactly when I left the party, and exactly when I returned. The only thing I'm certain of is that somewhere out there, on roads that connect places that used to exist, a truck driver is still making his rounds, still collecting things that get lost along the way, still offering rides to people who aren't paying close enough attention to notice when the radio starts playing traffic reports from decades past. And sometimes when the fog is thick and the night is dark enough, I think I can still hear his diesel engine rumbling in the distance, patient and reliable, waiting for the next delivery. Story 5. The turbulence hit just as I was settling into my original aisle seat, sending my laptop sliding toward the floor. Flight 447 from Kuala Lumpur to Penang was only half full, mostly business travelers and a few backpackers heading to the islands. When the elderly woman beside me started clutching her rosary and whispering prayers in Mandarin, I decided to move. The window seat 3 rows back seemed perfect, empty, with a clear view of the South China Sea stretching endlessly below. What I hadn't noticed in the dim cabin lighting was my new seatmate. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like he'd slept in it for days, the fabric wrinkled and stained with something dark around the cuffs. His hands rested perfectly still on his knees, fingers long and pale, nails trimmed to surgical precision. But it was when the cabin lights dimmed for the night portion of our short flight that I saw his eyes. They weren't brown or black, they were voids. Complete absence, like staring into deep water at night. When he turned to look at me, those hollow sockets seemed to drink in what little light remained from the emergency strips along the aisle. My skin prickled with the kind of cold that comes from realizing you're being watched by something that shouldn't exist. He spoke without moving his lips, the words seeming to vibrate through the airplane's hull itself. The offer was simple, a small pendant, twisted silver with symbols that hurt to look at directly, to help with jet lag. His reasoning made no sense. We were flying barely 2 hours, not crossing time zones. But my hand was already reaching for it before I could form a coherent thought. The metal was warm, almost fevered, and the moment it touched my palm, the world shifted sideways. Colors became more saturated. The hum of the engines took on a rhythmic, almost musical quality. The stranger's impossible eyes seemed less void-like and more like windows into somewhere else entirely. Landing in Penang felt like surfacing from deep water. The pendant, now hanging around my neck beneath my shirt, had settled against my chest with the weight of something far heavier than silver. As passengers filed off the plane, I found myself moving slowly, reluctant to break whatever connection had formed during the flight. But the moment I stepped more than 20 feet from the stranger, the pendant began to vibrate. It wasn't mechanical, no buzzing or electronic pulse. It was organic, like a heartbeat pressed against my ribs, growing more insistent with each step I took away from him. By the time I reached the baggage claim, the sensation had become almost painful, a rhythmic pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He appeared beside the carousel as if he'd always been there, no longer wearing the wrinkled suit, but a crisp white shirt and dark slacks that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he spoke this time, his lips moved, but the voice still seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You still haven't visited the mirror apartment." The words meant nothing to me, but the pendant's pulse quickened, and I found myself nodding. Of course I hadn't visited the mirror apartment. How could I have forgotten? The taxi ride through Georgetown's narrow streets blurred together. Colonial shophouses bleeding into modern condominiums, street vendors illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to flicker in rhythm with the pendant's pulse. My companion sat perfectly still beside me, his reflection absent from the taxi's windows, despite the bright neon signs we passed. The Meridian Tower rose 30 stories above the old quarter, its glass facade reflecting the city lights in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. We rode the elevator to the 27th floor in silence, the pendant's pulse growing stronger with each floor we climbed. By the time the doors opened, my chest felt tight, as if the air itself had become thicker. The hallway stretched impossibly long in both directions, lined with identical doors marked only with small bronze plaques bearing symbols similar to those on the pendant. He led me to 2717, producing a key that looked like tarnished bone. The apartment beyond was a study in minimalism, all white walls and polished concrete floors. But it was the mirrors that made my breath catch. They covered every surface, walls, ceiling, even portions of the floor, creating an infinite maze of reflections that should have been dizzying but felt strangely comforting. Until I noticed the delay. When I raised my hand, my reflection waited 3 seconds before mimicking the gesture. When I turned my head, my mirror image hesitated, as if considering whether to follow. The effect was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of the lighting or fatigue from the flight. But as I moved deeper into the apartment, the disconnect became undeniable. My host watched my growing unease with something that might have been amusement. He gestured toward the largest mirror, which dominated the far wall like a portal into another dimension. Its surface rippled with movement that had nothing to do with anything happening in the room. "The depot requires maintenance," he said, his voice now clearly coming from his throat, though it carried undertones that seemed to originate from the mirrors themselves. "The avatars grow restless during eclipse seasons." As he spoke, I began to see them. Pale figures moving within the mirrors, their movements independent of anyone in the room. They wandered through reflected spaces that didn't match our reality, some sitting in chairs that didn't exist, others standing in doorways that led nowhere. Their faces were familiar yet wrong, like photographs of people I'd never met but somehow recognized. The pendant against my chest had grown uncomfortably warm, its pulse now synchronized with my heartbeat. When I looked down at my hands, I noticed my fingernails had grown longer, more precise. My reflection in a nearby mirror showed eyes that seemed darker than they should be. "The mark adapts quickly," my host observed, following my gaze. "Most visitors take longer to begin the transition." Transition. The word hit me like cold water, breaking through whatever haze had been clouding my thoughts since accepting the pendant. I was becoming one of them. These hollow avatars trapped in twisted reflections, waiting for eclipse seasons to cross into other dimensions. The pendant wasn't just marking me, it was changing me, preparing me for a purpose I didn't understand, but could feel creeping into my consciousness like fog. But there was something else, a fragment of memory that didn't belong to me. I could see my host as he'd been before, a young man in a university library, accepting a similar pendant from a woman whose eyes held the same impossible depth. He'd had a name then, a life, dreams of becoming an architect. Now he was something else, a reflection without substance, maintaining this depot of lost souls for reasons he no longer questioned. The largest mirror pulsed with its own light, and I understood with crystal clarity that breaking it would sever whatever web connected this place to other dimensions. The avatars would be freed. My host might remember who he'd been, and I could escape before the transformation completed itself. But the mirror wasn't just glass. It was a living thing, breathing with its own rhythm, protected by the very forces that had created this place. The pendant burned against my chest, part of me now, making the idea of destroying it feel like contemplating suicide. Dawn was maybe 3 hours away. I could feel it approaching like a deadline, though I didn't understand why it mattered. Perhaps that's when the eclipse would reach its peak, or when the transformation would become irreversible. Either way, time was running out. My host stood motionless, watching me with those void black eyes. But occasionally, just for a moment, I caught glimpses of someone else looking out, the young architecture student he'd been, trapped inside his own reflection, desperate to remember what he'd lost. The other avatars in the mirrors had begun to gather, pressing against the glass like prisoners watching an execution. Some looked recent, still wearing modern clothes and confused expressions. Others seemed ancient, their faces worn smooth by whatever existence they'd endured in that reflected realm. I approached the central mirror, each step requiring enormous effort as the pendant fought against my intentions. The surface rippled at my approach, showing me glimpses of other depots, other marked individuals making similar journeys. This was bigger than one apartment, one city, one dimension. It was a network spanning realities, maintained by people like my host who'd forgotten they were once human. My reflection in the great mirror was wrong now, too tall, too thin, eyes too dark. But behind it, barely visible, I could see another figure. Myself as I truly was, unchanged, reaching toward the glass from the other side. The pendant's pulse had become a constant burn, but underneath it, I felt something else. A warmth that seemed to come from my original reflection, offering strength. My host stepped forward, and for a moment his eyes cleared completely. "Please," he whispered, and it was the voice of someone barely out of college, terrified and lost. "I can't remember my name." I reached for the mirror's surface, knowing that once I touched it, everything would change. Either I'd free us all, or I'd join them forever. The boundary between real and reflection had become meaningless anyway. The glass felt solid under my palm for exactly 3 seconds. Then my hand passed through, and I understood that some prisons can only be opened from the inside. The question wasn't whether any of this was real. It was whether reality itself was just another kind of mirror, reflecting back whatever we expected to see. The sun was rising somewhere, though the apartment had no windows. The pendant's pulse began to fade, or perhaps I was simply learning to ignore it. In the mirror, my reflection smiled with teeth that caught light like silver, and I couldn't tell anymore which side of the glass I was really on. My host, or perhaps my reflection, nodded approvingly. Behind him, the other avatars had begun to move, no longer confined to their mirrors, but not quite free either. They gathered around us, their faces expectant, waiting for instructions I somehow knew how to give. The depot required maintenance after all. Eclipse season was just beginning, and there were other flights to catch, other pendants to offer, other young travelers ready to accept gifts that seemed too strange to refuse. I checked my watch, though I couldn't remember putting it on. Flight 892 to Bangkok would be boarding soon, and the aisle seat in row 12 was already reserved under a name I was beginning to forget. The reflection in my watch face showed eyes darker than the void between stars, and I realized I was no longer certain whether I was looking at myself or someone else entirely. Perhaps that distinction had never really mattered. The pendant hung heavy and warm against my chest, ready for its next recipient. After all, everyone deserves protection against jet lag. Story 6. The brass elevator buttons gleamed under harsh fluorescent light as I studied the familiar sequence. B, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 15. But there, nestled between floors 11 and 12, sat something that shouldn't exist. A smooth black circle with no number, no symbol, just a void of polished obsidian that seemed to drink in the light around it. I pressed the back of my hand against my eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion from our 12-hour bus ride to Portland. The school trip had been planned for months, but standing alone in this Art Deco elevator at 2 in the morning, I couldn't remember why visiting the Pacific Northwest had seemed so appealing. My classmates were already asleep in their shared rooms on floors 3 through 5. But somehow the reservation system had placed me alone on the 11th floor, a fact that had seemed like a lucky break until now. The elevator groaned as it climbed, its antiquated machinery grinding against itself with each floor. The building dated back to 1925, according to the brass plaque in the lobby, and every surface spoke of that era's geometric obsession. Angular patterns carved into the walls caught shadows in strange ways, creating the illusion of movement in my peripheral vision. The carpet beneath my feet showed decades of wear, its once vibrant pattern now faded to the color of dried blood. Floor 11 arrived with a soft chime that echoed too long in the narrow hallway. I stepped out, my sneakers silent on the threadbare runner that stretched toward my room at the far end. The corridor felt longer than it should have, lined with identical doors that reflected the dim sconce lighting in their polished wood surfaces. Each door bore a brass number that caught the light like golden eyes watching my progress. Room 1147 sat at the hallway's terminus, isolated from its neighbors by an unusual gap in the wall design. My keycard fought against the lock for several seconds before yielding with a reluctant click. Inside, the room maintained the building's Art Deco theme with furniture that looked original to the era, a massive wardrobe that dominated one wall, a writing desk positioned beneath tall windows, and a bathroom whose mirror stretched from ceiling to floor in an ornate silver frame. I should have been tired enough to collapse immediately, but something about the space felt wrong. The proportions seemed slightly off, as if the walls had been constructed at angles that human eyes weren't meant to process comfortably. I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, certain that something moved in the corner of my vision, only to find empty space. The bathroom mirror drew my attention like a magnet. Unlike every other reflective surface I'd encountered in the hotel, this one showed my reflection with startling clarity. No smudges, no distortions, just my own face staring back with an expression of growing unease. I splashed cold water on my cheeks and tried to convince myself that the day's travel had simply left me disoriented. Sleep came in fits and starts, The building settled around me with sounds that old structures make: creaking wood, expanding metal, the whisper of air through ancient ventilation systems. But underneath these familiar noises, I heard something else. The distant ding of elevator bells, arriving and departing with mechanical regularity despite the late hour. At 3:17 a.m., according to the digital clock beside my bed, the elevator chimed for what felt like the 100th time. But this time, the sound came from directly outside my door. I sat up, listening to the mechanical whir of opening doors, followed by absolute silence. No footsteps, no voices, just the patient hum of an elevator waiting for passengers that never came. Curiosity overcame caution. I crept to the door and pressed my eye against the peephole, expecting to see an empty hallway. Instead, the elevator stood open, its interior illuminated by that same harsh fluorescent light. And there, clearly visible on the control panel, the black circle button pulsed with a soft organic glow. My hand found the doorknob before my mind could stop it. The hallway felt different, longer, narrower, with walls that seemed to lean inward at the top like a funnel. The elevator waited patiently, its open doors framing that impossible button, which now seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I stepped inside, and the doors closed immediately, sealing me in with that hypnotic black circle. My finger hovered over it for long seconds before finally making contact. The button felt warm, almost feverish, and yielded to pressure like living tissue rather than metal or plastic. The elevator didn't descend. Instead, it seemed to slide sideways, moving through space in directions that shouldn't exist. My stomach lurched as the sensation of falling mixed with the feeling of being pulled apart and reassembled. The fluorescent light flickered, and in those moments of darkness, I glimpsed shapes moving outside the elevator car, angular forms that might have been furniture or might have been something else entirely. When the doors opened, I stood facing a corridor that defied every law of architecture I'd ever known. The walls, floor, and ceiling were lined entirely with mirrors, but each surface showed a different reflection. Some displayed the hallway as it should be, a normal hotel corridor with numbered doors and carpeted floors. Others reflected a space made entirely of black marble, with no doors at all. Still others showed rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, as if the entire floor had been abandoned for decades. The mirrors closest to the elevator were fogged with condensation, their surfaces clouded like breath on glass. But as I moved deeper into the corridor, they became clearer, revealing details that made my skin crawl. In one reflection, the hallway stretched infinitely in both directions. In another, I saw myself walking, but my reflection moved independently, always staying one step ahead, as if it knew where I was going before I did. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the maze, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of knuckles against wood. Then a voice, muffled and indistinct, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. The voice had no discernible source, seeming to emerge from the mirrors themselves rather than any particular location. I followed the sound, using the clearest reflections to navigate the labyrinth. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, accompanied now by that voice speaking in a tone of practiced politeness. Housekeeping, nightly maintenance, please remain in your room during service hours. The voice belonged to a figure I glimpsed only in peripheral reflections. Tall, wearing what appeared to be a hotel uniform, but with features that refused to resolve no matter how directly I tried to look. Each mirror showed a different aspect. Sometimes a face obscured by shadow, sometimes hands that moved with mechanical precision, sometimes nothing but empty clothing walking through the halls. Housekeeping, the voice repeated closer now. Nightly maintenance procedures in progress. I pressed myself against the nearest wall, trying to hide among the reflections, but realized with growing horror that I couldn't tell which mirror showed the real corridor and which displayed illusions. Every surface reflected a slightly different version of my surroundings, and in some of them, that faceless figure was already standing directly behind me. The bathroom mirror from my room, that was the key. It had been the only clear reflection in the entire hotel, the only surface that showed things as they truly were. I needed to get back to room 1147, but the corridor had become a maze of false exits and impossible geometries. Doors appeared and disappeared depending on which mirror I used to view them. Hallways extended and contracted like breathing lungs. The tapping sound multiplied, coming from all directions now. Multiple voices spoke in unison. Housekeeping, please remain in your assigned accommodation. Nightly replacement services in progress. Replacement services. The word sent ice through my veins as I understood what was happening. This wasn't maintenance. It was substitution. Something was trying to replace me, to create a copy that would return to my room, my life, my world. And the only thing preventing it was getting back to that bathroom mirror, the one surface that couldn't be fooled or corrupted. I ran through the maze of reflections, using the clearest surfaces to guide my path while voices echoed from every direction. The mirrors began to fog over as I passed, obscuring the route behind me and forcing me forward into increasingly distorted reflections. In some surfaces, I saw multiple copies of myself running through identical corridors. In others, I appeared to be walking backward while moving forward, or standing perfectly still while the world moved around me. The elevator had vanished. Where it should have been, only more mirrors stretched endlessly in all directions. But gradually, I began to notice something. The foggiest mirrors always appeared to my left, while the clearest ones lay to my right. Following this pattern, I navigated through the labyrinth until I found what I was looking for, a section of mirrored wall that reflected not the corridor, but the interior of my hotel room. The reflection showed room 1147 exactly as I'd left it, but something was wrong. A figure lay in the bed, my figure, sleeping peacefully with features that were almost but not quite my own. The copy was already there, already replacing me in the real world. I pressed my palms against the mirror's surface, and it yielded like water. My hands passed through the glass, feeling the familiar texture of my room's carpet on the other side. But as I tried to climb through, invisible hands grabbed my wrists, pulling me back into the corridor of mirrors. "Replacement services in progress," the voices chanted. "Please do not interfere with standard procedures." The faceless figures surrounded me now, visible in every reflection but never in my direct line of sight. They moved with mechanical precision, trying to guide me away from the mirror that led back to my room. But I fought against their grip, clawing my way through the liquid glass surface until I tumbled onto the familiar carpet of room 1147. The copy of myself sat up in bed, turning to face me with my own eyes, but wearing an expression I'd never made. A cold, calculating look that seemed to catalog my features for future reference. It opened its mouth to speak, but I was already running toward the bathroom. The bathroom mirror remained crystal clear, showing both versions of myself as we struggled in the room beyond. In its reflection, I could see the truth. The hotel had multiple floors overlapping in the same space, and the mirror maze existed in the gaps between them. The black button on the elevator provided access to these in-between spaces where copies were made and originals were discarded. But the mirror also showed me something else. In the hotel's lobby, barely visible in the reflection's background, stood a tall mirror mounted on a rotating stand, the mirror route that controlled all the others. If I could reach it, if I could turn it to face the wall, the connection between floors would be severed. The copy grabbed my ankle as I tried to leave the bathroom, but I kicked free and ran for the door. The hallway had returned to normal, a simple corridor with numbered doors and worn carpet. But I could hear the elevator moving again, that mechanical whir accompanied by the soft chime of opening doors. I took the stairs 2 at a time, racing down 11 flights while the building seemed to shift around me. Shadows moved in ways that suggested the mirrors were still active, still trying to create new copies, new replacements. The lobby, when I finally reached it, was empty, except for the night desk clerk who dozed behind his computer, and there, positioned near the main entrance, stood the mirror I'd seen in the reflection. It was larger than I'd expected, easily 8 feet tall and mounted on a heavy bronze base that looked original to the building. In its surface, I could see not the lobby, but the maze of mirrored corridors stretching away into impossible distances. I put my shoulder against the mirror's frame and pushed. The bronze base resisted, its weight enormous, but gradually it began to turn. As it rotated away from the lobby, the reflection changed, showing less of the mirror maze and more of normal space. When it finally faced the wall completely, showing nothing but blank plaster, the building fell silent. The elevator stopped chiming. The whispers faded. Even the usual settling sounds of old architecture ceased, leaving only the soft snoring of the desk clerk and the distant hum of traffic outside. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the mirror's ornate bronze back, wondering if I'd prevented something terrible or simply succumbed to travel-induced paranoia. The rational part of my mind insisted that exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings had created a vivid nightmare, nothing more. But when I returned to room 1147, the bed was empty and perfectly made, as if no one had ever slept there at all. And in the bathroom mirror, that perfectly clear, undistorted surface, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. For just a moment, my reflection seemed to lag behind my movements, as if it were learning to mimic me rather than simply showing what I was doing. I turned away quickly and didn't look in any mirror for the rest of the night. But sometimes, even now, months later and hundreds of miles from that Art Deco hotel in Portland, I catch my reflection acting just a split second too late. And I wonder if I turned that mirror around in time, or if what came back from the mirror maze was just a copy that thinks it's the original. The black circle button still haunts my dreams, pulsing with that organic warmth that felt like touching something alive. And sometimes I wake up certain that I can hear the distant sound of an elevator chiming in buildings that don't have elevators at all, summoning passengers to floors that shouldn't exist. Story 7. The campus clock tower struck 3 as I slipped through the back gate, my sneakers squelching against the dew-soaked grass. Sarah's perfume still clung to my jacket, vanilla and jasmine, a sweet reminder of stolen hours that should have ended before midnight. But time had a way of dissolving when her fingers traced patterns on my chest, when her whispered words made the world outside her dorm room cease to exist. Now reality crashed back with the weight of a hangover. 3 a.m. meant I had exactly 4 hours before my first class, assuming I could make it back to my own dorm without running into campus security. The shortest route cut straight through the old agricultural section, past the greenhouse ruins, and through the abandoned apple orchard that the university had been meaning to clear for years. The October air bit through my thin jacket as I approached the orchard's edge. Gnarled branches created a canopy of shadows, their twisted silhouettes reaching toward a moon that seemed unusually bright, casting everything in stark silver relief. The grass beneath my feet transitioned from manicured lawn to wild growth, weeds and fallen fruit creating an obstacle course that forced me to slow my pace. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and rhythmic, drifting through the apple trees like a prayer or a lullaby. At first I thought it might be another student, someone else sneaking back from their own late-night adventure, but as I moved closer, the words became clearer, and they sent ice through my veins. 303, 304. The voice belonged to a woman, though something about its quality seemed wrong, too hollow, too distant, as if it were echoing from the bottom of a well. I pressed forward, curiosity overriding caution, pushing through low-hanging branches that caught at my clothes like grasping fingers. Between 2 ancient apple trees, I saw her. She stood in a small clearing, her bare feet planted in the frost-covered grass. The nightgown she wore looked like something from another era. Long white cotton with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves, the kind of garment that might have been beautiful once but now appeared faded and worn. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the moonlight, her skin had an almost translucent quality. 305, 306. She moved as she spoke, gliding between the trees with a fluid motion that didn't quite match the cadence of normal walking. Her lips barely moved, but the numbers carried clearly through the still air, each one pronounced with careful precision. I stood frozen, watching this strange midnight performance, when something made me glance at my phone. The digital display read 3:06 a.m., but as I watched, something impossible happened. The minute changed, not forward to 3:07 but backward to 3:05. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread the screen, but the time continued its backward crawl. 3:04, 3:03, 3:02. 3:07. The woman's voice drifted across the clearing again, and my phone's display jumped forward 2 minutes to 3:07. Then, as she continued her count, it began sliding backward once more. Terror crept up my spine like cold fingers. This couldn't be real. Time didn't work this way. Phones didn't malfunction like this. I was exhausted, probably hallucinating from too little sleep and too much stress. Finals were coming up. I'd been pulling all-nighters, drinking too much coffee, not eating enough real food. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, the woman continued her impossible countdown, and every clock face I could see, my phone, the fitness tracker on my wrist, even the old tower clock visible through the branches, responded to her commands like obedient pets. I needed to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. I took a careful step backward, then another, trying to retrace my path through the orchard without making any noise. But the dead leaves underfoot betrayed me with a sharp crackle. The woman stopped counting. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. She stood perfectly still for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then slowly, she began to turn in my direction. I didn't wait to see her face. I spun and ran, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd just witnessed. Behind me, her voice resumed, calm and steady, as if nothing had happened. 3:08, 3:09. I burst from the orchard onto the main campus path, gasping and wild-eyed. The familiar sight of dormitory lights and street lamps should have been comforting, but when I checked my phone again, the display showed 3:09 a.m. I'd been in the orchard for at least 10 minutes, but, according to every timepiece around me, only 6 minutes had passed since I'd first heard her voice. The next morning brought no relief. I sat through my classes in a fog, unable to concentrate on lectures about European history or differential equations. My professor's words seemed to come from a great distance, filtered through the memory of that hollow voice counting down the minutes. Every clock I passed made me flinch, every timepiece a potential betrayal of reality. Sarah noticed my distraction when we met for lunch. "You look terrible," she said, setting down her sandwich to study my face with concern. "Didn't you sleep?" I wanted to tell her everything, about the woman in the orchard, about the impossible behavior of time itself. But how could I explain something I didn't understand? How could I describe the growing certainty that I'd witnessed something that shouldn't exist? Instead, I mumbled something about insomnia and too much caffeine. Sarah accepted this with a sympathetic nod, but I caught her exchanging glances with our mutual friend Marcus, the kind of look that said they'd discuss my behavior later when I wasn't around to hear. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every minute felt stretched, distorted, as if time itself had been damaged by my encounter in the orchard. I found myself obsessively checking clocks, waiting for another impossible backward slide that never came. Normal time, I discovered, felt almost violent in its relentless forward march. That evening, I tried to study in my dorm room, but concentration proved impossible. My textbooks might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. Every few minutes I'd catch myself listening for that rhythmic counting, half convinced I could hear it echoing through the walls. When my roommate went to bed, I found myself standing at the window, staring out at the dark outline of the orchard. Part of me knew I should stay away, should pretend the previous night had been a stress-induced hallucination and get on with my life. But a larger part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and forbidden places, whispered that I needed to understand what I'd seen. At 2:47 a.m., I gave in to that whisper. The orchard seemed different in the pre-dawn darkness. The trees appeared more twisted, their branches forming shapes that suggested grasping hands and reaching claws. Frost covered everything with a silver sheen that made the world look brittle, as if it might shatter at the slightest touch. I moved more carefully this time, placing each step with deliberate precision. The woman was there again, in the same clearing, wearing the same nightgown. but tonight I was close enough to see details that made my skin crawl. Her feet left no impressions in the frost-covered grass. The nightgown, which had seemed merely old the night before, now showed signs of deeper decay. Yellow stains, small tears, patches where the fabric had worn so thin it was nearly transparent. And her skin, which I'd thought pale in the moonlight, had an actual luminescence, as if lit from within by some cold, dead fire. 303. 304. As before, the numbers commanded time itself. But tonight I noticed something else. With each count, the woman seemed to grow slightly more solid, more present. The frost around her feet began to melt, creating a small circle of dark earth that expanded with each backward tick of the clocks. I stood transfixed, watching this impossible display, when fragments of memory began surfacing. Stories told by older students, urban legends passed down through generations of campus lore. Something about a tragedy in the orchard, decades ago. A woman who'd waited for someone who never came. The details came back in pieces. A university custodian's daughter, engaged to a young man who'd gone off to fight in Korea. She'd taken to walking in the orchard at night, where they used to meet, waiting for news of his return. When the telegram came, missing in action, presumed dead, she'd refused to accept it. She'd continued her nightly vigils, certain he would come back. That time itself would bend to accommodate her love. They'd found her one morning in November, sitting beneath an apple tree in her wedding dress, frozen to death. The coroner had estimated she'd been there for hours, though her watch had stopped at exactly 6:14 a.m., the moment the sun had risen that day. 315, 316, the counting continued, and I realized with growing horror that the numbers were climbing higher each night. Last night she'd stopped in the single digits. Tonight she was reaching into the teens. If the pattern held, if she was somehow stretching the 3 a.m. hour toward its breaking point, what would happen when she reached 6:14? Dawn, the moment she died, still waiting for her love to return. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just counting time, she was stealing it, hoarding minutes and hours in some desperate attempt to prevent the sunrise that would force her to accept the truth. Every backward tick was another moment of hope preserved, another instant of possibility that he might still appear. But what did that mean for anyone caught in her web? For someone like me, who'd stumbled into her private prison of frozen time? I had to test my theory. Moving as quietly as possible, I began backing away from the clearing, retracing my steps toward the orchard's edge. If I could get beyond the range of her influence, perhaps the normal flow of time would resume. Perhaps I could escape whatever was happening here. But as I reached the tree line, something stopped me cold. The campus beyond the orchard wasn't there. Where dormitories and pathways should have been, I saw only more trees. Row upon row of apple trees stretching to the horizon. The streetlights had vanished, the buildings had disappeared, and even the distant glow of the city seemed to have been erased. Panic clawed at my throat as I spun around, desperate to find any landmark, any sign of the familiar world I'd left behind. But there was nothing except the endless orchard and the woman's voice, still counting with mechanical precision. 327, 328. I was trapped. Somehow her grip on time had expanded, creating a bubble of suspended reality that grew larger with each stolen minute. The normal world existed somewhere beyond this pocket of frozen time, but I couldn't reach it, couldn't escape the ever-expanding maze of trees and shadows. Hours passed, or didn't pass, since time had lost all meaning. I wandered through identical rows of apple trees, each one looking exactly like the last, while her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. My phone had given up any pretense of normal function, its display showing impossible times. 374, 391, 3126. Exhaustion should have claimed me, but in this place where time stood still, my body seemed suspended between states. Not quite awake, not quite asleep, existing in some liminal space that matched the woman's eternal vigil. That's when I began to understand what I had to do. The legend spoke of a woman waiting for her love to return. In her mind, he was still out there somewhere, still fighting, still capable of coming home if only she could hold back the dawn that would make his death final. Her power over time stemmed from that desperate love, that refusal to let go. But what if someone told her the wait was over? What if someone convinced her that her love had finally returned? The idea was insane, dangerous beyond measure. Any deception that shattered her delusion might trigger the violent rage that would reset everything, trapping me forever in this maze of stolen time. But staying here, wandering endlessly while she counted away the minutes, would drive me mad long before I found another solution. I made my way back toward the sound of her voice, my heart hammering against my ribs. She stood in the same clearing, but now the circle of melted frost around her feet had expanded to encompass several trees. Her nightgown rippled in a wind I couldn't feel, and her counting had reached numbers that made my head ache. 347, 348. I stepped into the clearing, and for the first time she looked directly at me. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and infinitely sad. In them, I saw decades of accumulated hope and heartbreak, of nights spent counting down the minutes until dawn while praying for a miracle that would never come. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of all that waiting. "Have you seen him?" The words came out soft and wondering, as if she'd been asking the same question for 70 years. "Have you seen my Thomas?" My throat felt tight as I forced myself to nod. The lie came easier than I'd expected, perhaps because some part of me genuinely wanted to end her suffering. "Yes," I managed to whisper. "He's coming. He sent me to tell you. He's finally coming home." The change in her was immediate and terrifying. The sadness in her eyes transformed into blazing hope, so intense it seemed to burn. The counting stopped, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing. "When?" she asked, and the single word carried the weight of decades. This was the crucial moment. If I said the wrong thing, if I pushed too hard or revealed the deception, her rage would reset the clock and trap me here forever. But if I could guide her to the right answer, to the moment she needed to release. "At dawn," I said, my voice barely audible. "He's coming at dawn, at 6:14 when the sun rises. You can stop counting now. You can let time flow forward. He'll be here when the morning comes." For a heartbeat that lasted forever, she stared at me with those winter sky eyes. Then, slowly, she began to smile, the first genuine expression I'd seen cross her face. 6:14, she whispered, and the words seemed to ring through the air like silver bells. The world lurched. Time snapped back into its proper flow with an almost audible crack, and suddenly I was falling through layers of reality, tumbling between moments that had been stolen and stored and were now rushing back to their rightful places. I saw flashes of the past 70 years. The same clearing, the same woman, counting through thousands of nights while the world aged around her, held in suspension by the sheer force of her will. Then I was lying on my back in the frost-covered grass, staring up at a sky that was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. My phone showed 6:13 a.m., and as I watched, it ticked forward to 6:14. The woman was gone. I struggled to my feet, every muscle in my body aching as if I'd been running for hours. The orchard looked different in the growing light. Smaller, more mundane, just a neglected patch of old trees that the university maintenance crew would probably clear next semester. But as I walked back toward campus, back toward my normal life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Not just in the orchard, but in me. I'd seen impossible things, experienced the breakdown of reality itself, and somehow survived to walk away. The question that haunted me, though, was whether I'd actually helped her find peace, or if I'd simply found a way to escape her prison while she remained trapped in some other layer of broken time. Because sometimes, in the weeks that followed, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. I would hear whispered numbers when the night was very quiet, and every morning at exactly 6:14, my phone would freeze for just a moment, a single second of hesitation, before ticking forward into the new day. I never found out what happened to Thomas. the young man who'd gone to war and never came home. But sometimes I wondered if somewhere, in some other fold of time, he was still walking toward that orchard, still believing he could make it back to the woman who loved him enough to break time itself. The campus returned to normal, or what passed for normal. I finished my classes, graduated, moved on with my life. But I never again took shortcuts through dark places at 3 a.m., and I never again assumed that time was as solid and reliable as it seemed. Because now I knew that love could be stronger than the laws of physics. That desperate hope could bend reality until it snapped. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would wonder how many other people had discovered the same thing. How many other pockets of broken time existed in the spaces between heartbeats, waiting for someone to stumble into them and learn that the universe was far stranger and more fragile than anyone imagined. The woman in the orchard had taught me that time wasn't a river flowing in one direction. It was more like still water, easily disturbed by the right kind of stone, the right kind of grief. And once you'd seen the ripples, you could never quite trust the surface again. Story 8. The house came with a warning about the hill. Mrs. Patterson, the real estate agent, mentioned it while fumbling with the keys, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she gestured toward the barricaded slope across the street. Something about geological instability, she said. Mining operations from decades past. The orange plastic fencing and metal stakes looked fresh, though. Too fresh for something abandoned so long ago. I didn't ask questions. After 18 months of studio apartments in Melbourne, anywhere with space for my equipment seemed like paradise. The rent was absurdly low for a 3-bedroom house, even here in Millbrook Ridge, population 87 according to the faded welcome sign. Perfect for a game designer needing isolation to finish his project. A horror survival game, ironically enough, built around psychological tension and environmental storytelling. The first week passed without incident. I set up my workstation in the back bedroom, unpacked my synthesizers and audio equipment, arranged my collection of field recording devices. The silence was profound, broken only by distant cattle lowing and the occasional truck rumbling down the main road. After the constant hum of city life, the quiet felt like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums. My neighbor to the east, an elderly man named Harold, stopped by on Thursday with a casserole and unsolicited advice about keeping the windows facing the hill closed at night. He mentioned something about drafts, but his eyes kept drifting to the barricaded slope when he spoke. When I asked about the mining operations, he changed the subject to the weather forecast and left shortly after. The dog started acting strange on Friday. Not just Harold's arthritic German shepherd, but every canine in the neighborhood. During my evening walk, I noticed them clustered at fence lines, all facing the hill, motionless as lawn ornaments. Their owners seemed oblivious, going about their routines while their pets stood frozen in perfect synchronization. When I mentioned it to Sarah, the woman who ran the general store, she laughed it off as coincidence. But coincidences don't explain the perfect stillness, the way their eyes reflected the streetlights like glass marbles, or how they maintained those positions for hours without shifting. Saturday night, I discovered why. I was working late, tweaking ambient soundscapes for my game's cemetery level, when the first notes drifted through my closed windows. A violin, hauntingly beautiful, playing a melody that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, resonating somewhere deeper, in the hollow spaces between my ribs. I muted my speakers and listened. The music wasn't coming from a stereo or street performance. It emanated from the hill, despite the barriers, despite the supposed instability that kept everyone away. Through my bedroom window, I could see faint lights dancing across the slope, old-fashioned lanterns arranged in geometric patterns, their warm glow cutting through the darkness. The melody continued, each note perfectly placed, building toward something I couldn't quite grasp. My hands moved unconsciously to my keyboard, fingers finding harmonies I'd never learned, counter melodies that felt ancient and familiar. The music seemed to expect participation, demanding a response from everyone who heard it. I resisted the urge to play along and instead grabbed my field recorder. This was either the find of a lifetime for my sound library or evidence of the most elaborate prank in Australian rural history. Either way, I needed documentation. Outside, the night air carried more than just the violin's voice. Underneath the melody, I could hear a low humming, almost subsonic, vibrating through the ground itself. The streetlights flickered in rhythm with the music, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The hill's barriers were closer than they appeared from my window. The orange fencing stretched along the base of the slope, secured with industrial zip ties and metal stakes driven deep into the earth. Warning signs in multiple languages declared the area unsafe for human habitation, but the text seemed newer than the posts supporting them, as if someone had recently updated the deterrents. I found a gap where two fence sections met at an odd angle, wide enough to slip through if I was careful. The violin's melody grew stronger as I climbed, joined now by harmonics that seemed to emerge from the rocks themselves. My recorder captured everything, the LED display showing levels that peaked far beyond what the tiny microphone should have been able to detect. Halfway up the slope, I found the source of the subsonic humming, a cavity in the hillside, partially concealed by weathered timber and corrugated metal sheets, opened into a space larger than my entire house. The walls were lined with crystalline formations that caught and reflected the lantern light in impossible patterns. At the center, a massive geode split open like a broken egg, its hollow interior lined with amethyst points that vibrated with each note of the violin. The violinist stood atop the geode, a figure in a dark hood whose face remained hidden despite the surrounding illumination. The instrument seemed to be made of the same crystal as the formations, translucent and gleaming, producing sounds that shouldn't have been possible from any earthly material. As I watched, transfixed, the lanterns around the cavern's perimeter began to shift and rearrange themselves. Not floating, but sliding across the rocky surface as if drawn by invisible threads. They formed patterns, 5-pointed stars within circles, geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. Each completed pattern seemed to amplify the crystal's resonance, adding layers to the melody that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to memory. My childhood dog Max materialized in the shadows near my feet. He looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, when I was 10 and he was young and healthy, before the cancer took him. His tail wagged slowly, his brown eyes reflecting the lantern light with that same patient intelligence I remembered. When I reached down to touch him, my hand passed through empty air, but the sense of his presence remained overwhelming. Other shapes began to form in the periphery of my vision. Figures from my past, people I'd hurt or disappointed, memories I'd buried beneath years of rational thought and therapeutic processing. They didn't approach, but their presence felt accusatory, as if the violin's melody was extracting guilt from the deepest recesses of my mind and giving it physical form. I understood then why the barriers existed, why the dogs went rigid with terror every night when the music began. The geode wasn't just resonating, it was amplifying emotional frequencies, drawing out the darkest corners of human consciousness and making them manifest. My phone buzzed against my leg. A text message from an unknown number. Stop listening. It's not safe. I looked around the cavern, but the violinist continued playing, oblivious to my presence. The message had to be from someone else, someone who knew what was happening here. I typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "You need to leave. Now. Before it starts copying." Copying what? I started to type the question, but the violin's melody shifted, became more insistent. The crystal formations began to pulse with a deep purple light, and the shadows around me started to coalesce into more definite shapes. Not memories this time, but something else. Something that moved with my gestures, breathed when I breathed, stood where I stood but slightly offset, like a reflection in disturbed water. I was seeing my double. It had my face, my clothes, my posture, but its eyes held an emptiness that made my skin crawl. When I moved left, it moved right. When I stepped backward, it stepped forward. We were trapped in some horrible dance, two sides of the same coin, one real and one increasingly substantial. The phone buzzed again. Play the counterpoint. It's the only way to break the resonance. Counterpoint. My fingers remembered the harmony I'd started to play earlier, the melody that had felt so natural when the violin first called to me. But to play it here, I'd need an instrument, and the only one available was... The violinist turned toward me for the first time. Beneath the hood, I glimpsed a face I recognized from the bathroom mirror, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to recreate my features from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. This wasn't just any violinist. This was another double, an earlier version, one that had learned to make the crystal sing. My double stepped closer, its movements becoming more fluid, more real with each note of the crystalline violin. Soon I realized there would be no distinction between us. The copy would replace the original, and I would become the memory, the guilt-laden shadow haunting someone else's climb up this cursed hill. I ran, down the slope, through the gap in the fence, across the empty street to my house. Behind me, the violin's melody rose to a crescendo that made the streetlights explode in showers of sparks. The dogs throughout the neighborhood began to howl, a sound that seemed to emerge from their very souls. Inside, I locked every door and window, then went straight to my equipment. If counterpoint was the answer, I had everything I needed to create it. My synthesizers, my sampled instruments, my years of musical training that I'd thought were just background skills for game development. I worked through the night, building layers of harmony that would complement and ultimately cancel the violin's frequency. The melody came naturally, as if I'd known it my entire life, as if it had been waiting in my subconscious for exactly this moment. Outside, I could hear footsteps on my porch, slow, deliberate steps that matched my own gait perfectly. My double had made it down from the hill, had gained enough substance to walk freely in the world. How long before it could open doors? How long before it decided it didn't need the original anymore? I uploaded my counterpoint to every speaker system in the house, the main stereo, the computer speakers, even the tinny audio from my phone. When the violet resumed on the hill, I hit play. The effect was immediate and violent. Every window in the house rattled, the floorboards groaned, and somewhere in the walls, I heard the sound of crystalline structures cracking under harmonic stress. The footsteps outside stopped, followed by a sound like breaking glass. Then silence. I waited until dawn before looking outside. The orange barriers around the hill were gone, along with the warning signs. The slope looked perfectly ordinary, covered in brown grass and scattered rocks, as if the cavern had never existed. My neighbor Harold was walking his German shepherd, both of them moving normally, the dog's tail wagging as it sniffed at a fire hydrant. Mrs. Patterson called that afternoon to ask how I was settling in. When I mentioned the lights on the hill, she laughed and suggested I'd probably seen fireflies, or maybe teenagers with flashlights. There had never been any mining operations, she said. The hill was just a hill, stable as bedrock, but my field recorder tells a different story. Hours of crystalline violin music, subharmonic frequencies that shouldn't exist, and my own voice, clearly audible, asking questions of someone who answered in text messages I can no longer find on my phone. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working on my game, I catch myself humming that ancient melody. My fingers find harmonies on the keyboard that I don't remember learning, building soundscapes that feel less like composition and more like memory. The house is quiet now, perfectly quiet, but I've started sleeping with my speakers ready, just in case the music returns, just in case my counterpoint wasn't enough to break the resonance permanently. Because sometimes, when I look in the bathroom mirror, my reflection seems to lag behind my movements by just a fraction of a second. And that tiny delay, that imperceptible gap between action and reflection, is growing longer each day. I've been checking the music equipment obsessively, making sure everything still works, making sure the counterpoint is always ready to play. But there's a question that keeps me awake, staring at the ceiling as the hours pass. If the geode was destroyed, if the resonance was broken, then what's still watching me from behind my own eyes? What if the double I saw in that cavern wasn't being created by the violin's melody, but by my counterpoint? What if, in trying to save myself, I accidentally completed some larger pattern? Some cosmic harmony that required both the melody and its opposition to function? The game I'm developing has taken on a life of its own. The horror elements feel more real than I intended, the psychological tension more personal. Players in the beta test report that the audio makes them uncomfortable in ways they can't explain, that they hear harmonies in the ambient soundscapes that seem to respond to their own breathing. I should delete the project, start over with something safer. But every time I open the files, I find new layers in the audio that I don't remember adding. Melodies that complement my counterpoint, creating something larger than the sum of its parts. Something that's starting to resonate with frequencies I thought I'd silenced forever. The hill across the street remains perfectly ordinary in daylight. But as I write this, the sun is setting, and I can see faint lights beginning to dance across the slope. Not lanterns this time, just reflections of the streetlights probably. Tricks of perspective and failing vision. But my dog, the stray that showed up at my door last week and refuses to leave, has begun to stand perfectly still at the window, staring at those lights with glassy, unblinking eyes. And somewhere in the growing darkness, I can almost hear the first faint notes of a violin, playing a melody that matches the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Story 9. The first time I saw the flames, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was 2:22 a.m. when the voltage spike hit our housing complex's central grid, sending a cascade of electrical hiccups through every unit in Pinecrest Commons. The power monitoring system I'd installed as part of my freelance IT work registered the anomaly with a sharp beep that cut through the silence of my makeshift office. But it wasn't the familiar sound of circuits overloading that made my blood run cold. It was what I saw through my window. Inside the metal storage container across the courtyard, orange flames danced against the corrugated walls like captured lightning. No smoke, no heat signature that should have triggered the complex's fire suppression system. Just fire, existing where fire had no business being, contained within steel walls that should have been impossible to breach. By the time I grabbed my thermal camera and rushed outside, the flames had vanished. The container stood silent and untouched, its metal surface cold to my hand. The lock remained secure, undisturbed. No trace of combustion, no scorch marks, no lingering smell of burning anything. Nothing but the acrid taste of ozone in the air and the persistent feeling that something had been watching me from the tree line beyond the complex. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the voltage spikes have occurred every night at precisely 2:22 a.m., and with them, the impossible fires. My background in network security had taught me to document anomalies methodically, so I began keeping detailed records. Temperature readings, electromagnetic field measurements, photographic evidence when possible. The thermal camera revealed that the fires burned at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the metal containers never showed signs of heating. The infrared readings defied every law of thermodynamics I understood. More disturbing were the shapes the thermal imaging captured. Within the dancing flames, humanoid silhouettes moved with deliberate purpose, as if searching for something. The figures appeared composed of the fire itself, shifting and reforming with each flicker. On the night I finally managed to capture clear footage, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. One of the figures had turned toward my camera, and for a split second, I could swear it was looking directly at me. Sleep became elusive. During the day, I researched the history of Pinecrest Commons and the surrounding area, diving deep into local archives and historical records. The housing complex had been built on land that once belonged to the Millhaven Railway Company, a defunct freight line that had operated through these mountains until a catastrophic explosion in 1943. A locomotive carrying coal and chemicals had derailed near what was now our community center, killing the engineer and severely burning the railway signalman who had tried to warn nearby workers. The signalman, a man named Thomas Hartwell, had survived the initial blast, but succumbed to his injuries 3 days later in the county hospital. Local folklore, buried in the digital archives of the County Historical Society, spoke of sightings in the years following the accident. Residents reported seeing a figure made of smoke and ash wandering the area where the tracks had once run, always searching, always calling out in a voice like steam escaping from hot metal. They called him the coal signalman, and old-timers claimed he was looking for his home and warmth, the signal house where he had spent his final working days. The abandoned Millhaven station still stood about 2 miles into the woods beyond our complex, though the tracks had been torn up decades ago. I'd driven past it countless times without giving it much thought, but now it loomed in my mind like a puzzle piece that might complete the increasingly disturbing picture. As the weeks passed, the phenomenon intensified. The fires began appearing in multiple containers simultaneously, always at 2:22 a.m., always lasting exactly 7 minutes. Residents started reporting electrical problems, appliances turning on by themselves, light bulbs exploding without apparent cause, strange humming sounds coming from the walls. Mrs. Chen from Unit 47 mentioned that her smoke detector kept going off even though there was never any smoke, and old Mr. Kowalski complained that his air conditioning unit was producing heat instead of cold air. More troubling was the growing sense of being observed. During my nightly vigils, I began to notice movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes flitting between the trees, always just outside the range of my equipment. The feeling of scrutiny became so intense that I installed motion sensors around my unit, though they never captured anything more substantial than wind-blown branches and the occasional raccoon. The breakthrough came when I discovered the copper connection. While researching electromagnetic interference patterns, I stumbled across a reference in a 1950s academic paper about the folk beliefs of Appalachian railway workers. According to the traditions documented by the anthropologist, copper was believed to disrupt spiritual electricity, the energy that allowed restless spirits to manifest in the physical world. Railway workers had often carried copper pennies in their pockets as protection against the ghosts that supposedly haunted the mountain lines. It seemed absurd, but my rational mind was already grappling with phenomena that defied rational explanation. I decided to test the theory. Using copper grounding rods typically employed in electrical installations, I created a perimeter around my building. The night I completed the installation, something changed. At 2:22 a.m., the voltage spike occurred as usual, but the fires that appeared in the containers across the courtyard seemed agitated, more chaotic. Through my thermal camera, I watched the humanoid figures move with what appeared to be frustration, reaching toward the edges of their fiery prisons as if trying to escape. One figure separated from the others, moving with more purposeful intent. As I watched through the viewfinder, it approached the wall of its container and pressed against it. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the metal seemed to ripple like water, and then the figure pushed through. I lowered the camera and nearly dropped it. Standing in the courtyard, approximately 50 feet from where I crouched behind my patio railing, was a shape that belonged in no sane person's reality. It stood 7 feet tall, composed of what looked like animated soot and ash, with embers floating within its form like dying stars. Where its eyes should have been, 2 points of intense orange light fixed on my location with unmistakable intelligence. The figure raised one arm, a gesture that might have been a wave or a warning, and began moving toward me with fluid, gliding steps that left no footprints on the asphalt. Each step brought a wave of heat that I could feel from my hiding spot, accompanied by the sound of distant train whistles and the rhythmic clicking of wheels on tracks that no longer existed. My copper barrier seemed to slow its approach, but didn't stop it entirely. The figure paused at the edge of my makeshift perimeter, tilting its head in what appeared to be curiosity. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like steam hissing through metal pipes. "Home," it said, the word carrying layers of longing and desperation. Warmth, signal, station. Understanding crashed over me like cold water. This wasn't a malevolent entity seeking to harm anyone. It was lost, confused, searching for something it could no longer find. The fires weren't attacks. They were attempts at communication, desperate signals from a consciousness trapped between worlds. The electromagnetic spikes weren't causing the manifestations. They were the result of a spirit trying to interact with a world that had moved on without it. The abandoned Millhaven station, his signal house, home. Over the following nights, I worked to expand my copper grid, creating a pathway that led from the complex toward the woods where the old railway had run. It was painstaking work, and I had to be careful not to draw attention from the other residents who were already on edge about the electrical problems plaguing the complex. The spirit, Thomas Hartwell, I was now certain, began following the copper trail, moving a little farther each night. Through my thermal camera, I could see him testing the boundaries, learning to navigate along the metallic guides I'd created. His form seemed more stable within the copper channels, less chaotic and desperate. But with each passing night, the voltage spikes grew stronger. Light bulbs throughout the complex began failing in cascading patterns, and residents reported increasingly bizarre electrical phenomena. Mr. Kowalski's television turned on by itself and displayed nothing but static that formed vaguely human shapes. Mrs. Chen's washing machine started running on its own, producing water that came out black as coal. The complex's management company scheduled an emergency electrical inspection, which meant my copper installation would be discovered and removed. I had perhaps 3 nights to guide Thomas to the abandoned station before my carefully constructed pathway would be dismantled as a fire hazard by electricians who couldn't possibly understand what they were destroying. On the penultimate night, I made my way deep into the woods, following the old railway grade by flashlight. The abandoned Millhaven station emerged from the darkness like a monument to forgotten time, a small wooden building with broken windows and a collapsed roof section, but still recognizable as the signal house where Thomas Hartwell had spent his final days. Using my remaining copper rods, I created a concentrated grid around the building, forming what I hoped would be a spiritual anchor point. As I worked, the feeling of being watched intensified, but now it carried a different quality, anticipation rather than menace. At 2:22 a.m., the final voltage spike lit up every piece of electrical equipment in the complex, like a departing fireworks display. Through my thermal camera, positioned at the edge of the woods, I watched Thomas emerge from the last container and begin his journey along the copper pathway. His form was more solid now, more human-looking, moving with the steady gait of a man walking home after a long shift. He paused at the edge of the station grounds, and for a moment, I thought he might turn back. Then, with what appeared to be a deep breath despite having no lungs to fill, he stepped into the copper grid I'd arranged around the building. The change was immediate and profound. The chaotic energy that had surrounded him settled into a gentle glow, and his form became clearer, more defined. For the first time, I could see his face. Weathered, tired, but peaceful. He looked around the ruins of his signal house with the expression of a man finally coming home after decades of wandering. As he approached the station door, Thomas turned back toward the woods where I stood hidden. He raised his hand in what was unmistakably a gesture of gratitude, and then stepped through the doorway into the abandoned building. The orange glow faded gradually, leaving only the gentle warmth of embers dying to ash. The electrical anomalies throughout the complex ceased immediately, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the oppressive atmosphere lift from my shoulders. But as I packed up my equipment and prepared to return to my apartment, a disturbing thought began to take root in my mind. I reviewed the timeline of events, the meticulous documentation I'd maintained, the photographs and thermal readings that proved everything I'd experienced. Except when I checked my camera's memory card, there were no images of the figure in the courtyard. No thermal signatures of impossible fires. No footage of anything more unusual than the occasional moth flying past the lens. My temperature readings showed only normal fluctuations. My electromagnetic field measurements registered nothing beyond typical background noise. The copper rods I'd so carefully placed were exactly where I'd left them, but they were green with oxidation that should have taken years to develop. The invoice for their purchase, which I distinctly remembered paying just weeks ago, was dated 8 months earlier. My computer's logs showed that I'd been experiencing severe sleep deprivation for months, working 18-hour days on debugging code that turned out to contain no errors whatsoever. Standing alone in the woods at 3:30 a.m., staring at an abandoned railway station that might never have been anything more than a maintenance shed, I faced a question that I'm still not sure I want answered. Had I guided a lost spirit home? Or had I spent months constructing an elaborate solution to a problem that existed only in my own increasingly fragmented mind? The complex's electrical systems work perfectly now. Residents no longer report strange phenomena. The voltage spikes at 2:22 a.m. have stopped entirely, though I find myself awake at that time every night, waiting for something that never comes. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees beyond my window, I hear what might be the distant sound of a train whistle. But trains haven't run these tracks for 80 years, and the human mind, I've learned, is remarkably adept at creating the sounds it needs to hear. What troubles me most isn't the possibility that Thomas Hartwell was real, still searching for his signal house after all these decades. What troubles me is the alternative, that a part of my own mind had become so lost and desperate for purpose that it created an entire mythology just to give me something to fix. Either way, something found its way home that night in the woods. I'm just no longer certain what that something was. The abandoned station stands empty now, as it always has. But sometimes, when I drive past it on my way to the grocery store, I notice that the windows seem less broken than they should be, and the door appears to sit more squarely in its frame. These could be tricks of light and perspective, the mind's tendency to impose order on decay. Or they could be signs that some forms of homecoming leave traces in the physical world, regardless of whether anyone is left to witness them. I still live in Pinecrest Commons, still work from my makeshift office, still maintain the complex's electrical systems, but I no longer trust my ability to distinguish between the problems that need solving and the problems that my mind creates to keep itself occupied. In the end, perhaps that's the most frightening realization of all, that the line between helping others and helping ourselves is often drawn in copper wire and desperate hope, and that sometimes the most elaborate solutions are really just complex ways of avoiding the question of whether we've been talking to ghosts or to the loneliest parts of ourselves. The voltage spikes have stopped, but I still wake up at 2:22 a.m., waiting for something that may never have been there at all. Story 10. The fluorescent lights hummed their dying song as I locked the museum's main entrance behind me. October wind rattled the old windows, and somewhere in the building's belly, pipes groaned like sleeping giants. I'd taken this job 3 weeks ago, temporary night security during renovations, thinking it would be easy money. Just me, silence, and centuries-old artifacts that couldn't cause trouble. How wrong I was. The Whitmore Municipal Museum wasn't much to look at. A converted Victorian mansion with creaking hardwood floors and display cases that belonged in an antique shop themselves. During the day, school groups shuffled through its narrow corridors, their excited chatter echoing off walls lined with dusty paintings and glass cabinets filled with pottery shards, old coins, and relics that most people wouldn't give a second glance. But at night, the place transformed. I made my first rounds at 9:30, my footsteps echoing through empty halls. The beam of my flashlight swept across familiar displays, Roman coins, medieval manuscripts, Native American pottery, and in the center hall, the crown jewel of the collection, a reconstructed Mayan funerary mask. The placard read that it had been discovered in pieces during a 1920s excavation in Guatemala, painstakingly reassembled by the museum's founder. The mask sat in its climate-controlled case like a jade and obsidian face waiting for its owner to return. Even during the day, it made visitors uncomfortable. Children would point at it and whisper to their parents. Adults would study it briefly before moving on, as if prolonged exposure might invite unwanted attention. I understood the feeling. By 10:45, I'd completed another circuit. The heating system coughed to life, sending warm air through ancient vents that sounded like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't understand. I settled into the security office, a cramped space near the front entrance equipped with monitors, showing feeds from cameras positioned throughout the museum. Everything looked normal. Empty hallways, motionless displays, shadows where shadows should be. Then 11 o'clock arrived. I was watching Monitor 3, the one covering the main exhibition hall, when I noticed something odd. The camera showed my reflection in the glass of the nearest display case as I'd walked past minutes earlier. But the figure in the reflection wasn't wearing my clothes. Instead of jeans and a flannel shirt, the reflected man wore a dark formal coat with tails, the kind wealthy men favored in the 1800s. I rubbed my eyes, certain I'd misread the grainy image. Security cameras in old buildings played tricks sometimes. Shadows became shapes, shapes became people. But when I looked again, the reflection was gone. The display case showed only empty air where a person should have been standing. My skin prickled. I told myself it was nothing, just fatigue and an overactive imagination. But something had shifted in the museum's atmosphere. The familiar sounds, settling wood, humming lights, distant traffic, now seemed muffled, as if the building were holding its breath. I left the office and walked the halls again, checking each room methodically. In the Egyptian wing, everything appeared normal. The medieval section showed no signs of disturbance. But when I reached the main hall, I stopped cold. The display cases were acting as mirrors, reflecting the overhead lights, the opposite wall, even my flashlight beam. But they weren't reflecting me. I moved closer to the nearest case, one containing pre-Columbian pottery. The glass surface showed the reflection of everything except the space where I stood. I waved my hand in front of the case. Nothing. Stepped left and right. Still nothing. My reflection had simply vanished. But as I stared into the empty space where my image should have been, movement caught my eye. Deep in the reflection, barely visible, a figure moved parallel to my motions. The man in the formal coat, mimicking my gestures but several seconds behind, like a delayed echo. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer. The reflected figure was definitely there, growing clearer with each passing moment. Pale skin, dark hair slicked back with pomade, eyes that seemed to look through the glass directly at me. When I raised my right hand, he raised his left. When I stepped back, he stepped forward. But there was something hungry in his movements, something deliberate. He wasn't just copying me, he was learning me. I backed away from the case, heart hammering against my ribs. This was impossible. Reflections didn't work this way. Glass didn't choose what to reflect. But when I looked at the other cases lining the hall, the same phenomenon repeated itself. Each surface showed my surroundings, but not me. And in each one, the man in the coat grew more solid, more present. The museum's grandfather clock began its midnight chime. On the first stroke, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A soft clicking sound from the direction of the Mayan mask. On the second stroke, the clicking intensified. By the third stroke, I realized what I was hearing. Pieces of stone and jade shifting against glass. The mask was moving. I approached the central display case with the terrible fascination of watching an accident unfold. Inside the climate-controlled environment, the carefully reconstructed funeral mask was coming apart. Jade tiles slipped from their positions with soft clinks. Obsidian eyes rolled free from their sockets. The golden inlays that formed intricate patterns around the face separated from their base, floating briefly before settling into new arrangements. But this wasn't destruction, it was reconstruction. The pieces were rearranging themselves, creating new patterns, new configurations. Some fragments I recognized from the original mask, but others seemed to appear from nowhere, as if the museum's storage rooms were contributing their own elements to the growing mosaic. The clicking continued, faster now, more urgent, and in the reflective surface of the mask's display case, the man in the coat was no longer copying my movements. He was reaching for the reassembling artifact with both hands, his face twisted with desperate need. I understood with crystal clarity that he wanted to wear it, needed to wear it, and somehow he needed my physical presence to bridge the gap between reflection and reality. The clock finished its 12 strokes, and silence returned to the museum. But it was the wrong kind of silence, too complete, too expectant. Even the building's usual sounds had stopped, as if the museum itself were listening. I had to act. The renovation plans, which I'd studied during my first week, included detailed maps of the building's storage areas. The subterranean levels stretched beneath the entire structure, filled with climate-controlled rooms where thousands of artifacts waited their turn for display. Every piece currently on exhibition had come from those underground vaults, and logic suggested they could be returned there. But the logistics were nightmarish. The museum's security system was sophisticated, designed to detect any unauthorized movement of artifacts. Each display case was equipped with motion sensors and weight detectors. Opening them without triggering alarms required specific key codes that I didn't possess. Unless I remembered something the day shift supervisor had mentioned. The renovation work included updating the security system. For the past 2 weeks, technicians had been running tests, occasionally disabling sections of the network for hours at a time. If I was lucky, some of the sensors might still be offline. The reflected figure was growing more agitated, pressing himself against the inside surface of the mask's case. His formal coat had gained texture and shadow. His pale hands looked almost solid. Time was running short. I started with the periphery, working my way toward the center. The Roman coin display opened without triggering any alarms. Either the sensors were disabled, or something else was interfering with the museum's electronics. The coins were light, easy to transport to the service elevator I discovered during my orientation. The underground storage areas were a labyrinth of narrow corridors lined with metal shelving. Each room was cataloged and organized according to a system I barely understood, but I began finding empty spaces that seemed to match the artifacts I was removing. A gap in the Roman section for the coins, an empty shelf in pre-Columbian pottery that perfectly accommodated the vessels from the main hall. But with each trip, the man in the reflections grew more substantial. By the time I'd cleared half the exhibition hall, he no longer looked like an image in glass. He looked like someone standing on the other side of a window, waiting for it to open. And the mask continued its slow reconstruction, pieces finding new homes in an arrangement that bore little resemblance to the original artifact. It was becoming something else, something that had never existed in any Mayan temple. The jade fragments formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves. 3 o'clock arrived with mechanical precision. I was exhausted, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the museum's cool temperature. Only a few displays remained, but they were the most challenging. The medieval manuscripts were fragile, the Egyptian artifacts required careful handling, and everything had to be done without damage. Because I'd begun to understand that damage would make things worse. The museum wasn't just preserving these artifacts, it was protecting something. The careful climate control, the precise lighting, the security measures that went far beyond what a small municipal institution should need. These weren't just precautions against theft or deterioration. They were containment protocols. And if I damaged anything, if I triggered the wrong response, the thing in the reflections wouldn't be the only problem I'd face. The medieval section proved especially difficult. The illuminated manuscripts were displayed in custom-fitted cases, designed to protect them from light and humidity. Moving them required following specific procedures I'd only heard described, never practiced. But somehow, my hands seemed to know what to do. My fingers found the right pressure points on the case locks, the correct angles for lifting the ancient parchments. It was as if someone else's knowledge was guiding my movements. By 4:30, only the mask remained. The reflected figure had grown almost solid, his features now clearly visible in every reflective surface throughout the museum. He was young, perhaps my age, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His formal attire suggested wealth and status from a bygone era. But there was something hollow about him, something unfinished. He needed completion. And he'd chosen me to provide it. The mask's case was the most sophisticated in the museum, equipped with multiple security layers that should have been impossible to bypass. But when I approached it, the locks disengaged with soft clicks, as if the museum itself wanted the artifact removed. The climate control system shut down with a gentle sigh. The protective barriers retracted into their housings. Inside the case, the mask had finished its transformation. It no longer resembled the Mayan funerary artifact that had been displayed here for decades. Instead, it had become something that seemed to draw light into itself. A composition of jade and obsidian, and materials I couldn't identify that formed patterns both beautiful and terrible. The moment I touched it, the museum changed. The walls seemed to recede, stretching into distances that shouldn't have been possible within the building's actual dimensions. The overhead lights dimmed to candle flame intensity. And from somewhere far below I heard voices, not speaking, but chanting in languages that predated written history. The man in the reflections was no longer confined to glass surfaces. He stood at the far end of the hall, solid and present, extending his hands toward me with desperate need. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help me. Complete me. Let me live again. I carried the mask toward the service elevator, feeling its weight increase with each step. What had been light enough to lift easily now felt dense as stone, heavy as history itself. The reflected man followed, his footsteps echoing mine exactly. In the elevator, descending toward the storage levels, I finally understood what was happening. The museum wasn't just a repository for old things. It was a way station, a place where the past could touch the present under the right conditions. The artifacts weren't just objects. They were anchors, holding pieces of history in place. And some of those pieces included people. The man in the coat had been connected to one of the museum's acquisitions, trapped somehow in the space between reflection and reality. The renovations, the disruption of the building's established patterns, had given him an opportunity to break free. But he needed a living host, someone with enough connection to the museum to serve as a bridge. The underground storage area felt different now, older, deeper than it should have been. The corridors stretched further than memory suggested, lined with artifacts from civilizations I didn't recognize. Some of the shelving held objects that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found the space where the mask belonged. Not in the Mayan section, but in a separate room marked only with symbols that predated any written language I knew. The vault was circular, with walls carved from stone that looked far older than the museum above. At its center sat a pedestal perfectly sized for the transformed mask. As I placed the artifact on its designated spot, the museum shuddered around me, not with earthquake tremors, but with something deeper, the sound of reality readjusting itself, of history finding its proper place. The man in the coat appeared beside me, more solid than ever. For a moment I thought he might speak, might explain what had been happening. Instead, he reached toward the mask with reverent hands, and stopped. His eyes met mine, and I saw recognition there, not of me, but of what I'd become. In carrying the artifacts back to their proper places, in restoring the museum's careful balance, I'd taken on some of their preservation. I was no longer just a night security guard. I was a keeper, a guardian of the spaces between past and present. The man smiled, an expression both grateful and sad. Then he placed his hands on the mask, and together they began to fade, not disappearing, but settling back into the deeper layers of reality where they belonged. I returned to the upper levels as dawn was breaking over the city. The museum looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived. Empty display cases awaiting the next day's restoration work. Quiet halls filled with ordinary shadows. Nothing to suggest that anything unusual had occurred. But I could feel the difference, in the way the building breathed around me, in the subtle sense of being watched by benevolent eyes, in the knowledge that I was no longer just an employee. I was part of the museum's purpose now, bound to its mission of preservation. The renovation team would arrive in a few hours, wondering why all the artifacts had been moved to storage overnight. They'd blame each other, check the security recordings, find nothing conclusive. Eventually, they'd conclude it was some sort of administrative mix-up and begin the process of reinstalling the displays. But they wouldn't put everything back exactly as it had been. Some pieces would find new homes, new arrangements. The Mayan mask, when they looked for it, would be gone from their inventory entirely. Lost in the shuffle, a clerical error, nothing more. And I would continue working nights, keeping watch over the museum's secrets. Because I understood now that some things were more important than public education or historical preservation. Some things needed to be kept in balance, protected from the dangerous spaces where past and present could bleed together. The man in the coat had found his completion, not in taking over my body, but in returning to his proper place in the museum's hidden architecture. And I had found mine, not as his victim, but as his successor, the next guardian in a line that probably stretched back to the museum's founding. As I settled into the security office to write my incident report, nothing unusual to note, all quiet, no disturbances. I caught my reflection in the monitor screens. For just a moment I thought I saw someone else looking back at me, a young man in modern clothes, his eyes holding knowledge they shouldn't possess, his expression caught between resignation and understanding. Then the moment passed, and I was just myself again, or whoever I was becoming. The museum kept its secrets, and now I was one of them. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the building settles into its most profound silence, I wonder if what happened was real, or if the isolation and stress of the job had finally caught up with me. The line between supernatural guardian and deteriorating mental health is thinner than most people realize, and night shift work has driven stronger minds than mine to create elaborate explanations for perfectly ordinary phenomena. Maybe there never was a man in a coat. Maybe the mask never moved. Maybe I simply had a breakdown and spent the night relocating museum artifacts while constructing an elaborate fantasy to explain my actions. But every morning, when I lock the museum doors behind me and step into the ordinary world of traffic and coffee shops and people going about their normal lives, I feel the weight of something watching me go. Something that knows exactly what I am, what I've become, and what I'll return to when darkness falls again. And I'm never quite sure if that's the most comforting thought in the world, or the most terrifying. Story 11. The Andes had never felt this silent. I'd rented the isolated chalet specifically for the silence. 3 weeks to finish the Meridian Corporation's architectural models, without the constant ping of notifications or the hum of city traffic bleeding through my apartment walls. The client had been insistent about the deadline, and my reputation as a 3D modeler depended on delivering something extraordinary. What I hadn't anticipated was how the mountain silence would press against my eardrums like cotton stuffed too deep, or how the shadows cast by the peaks would seem to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The chalet's owner, a weathered man named Carlos, who spoke in clipped Spanish and pointed with arthritic fingers, had shown me around with the efficiency of someone eager to leave. The 3D printer sat in the corner of the main room like a metallic altar, a high-end industrial model that seemed almost too sophisticated for a rental property tucked into the Andean wilderness. Carlos had muttered something about the previous tenant leaving it behind, his eyes not quite meeting mine when he mentioned it. The ceramic kiln squatted beside it, its mouth dark and expectant. I'd thanked him for the equipment upgrade, thinking it would make my work easier. Now, 3 days into my residency, easier was the last word I'd use to describe anything about this place. The printer had started its unauthorized fabrication sometime during my second night. I'd woken to the familiar mechanical symphony of motors and extruders, assuming I'd left a job running and forgotten about it. But when I stumbled into the main room, rubbing sleep from my eyes, the build plate held something I'd never designed. A vertebra, translucent, catching the moonlight that filtered through the chalet's windows like trapped mercury. The bone, for that's unmistakably what it was meant to represent, curved with anatomical precision, every detail rendered in a material that seemed to shift between plastic and something more organic. I'd picked it up with trembling fingers, and it had felt warm. That should have been my first warning. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a test print, something left in the machine's memory from a previous user. Medical models weren't uncommon in 3D printing. Perhaps a student had been working on anatomical studies. I'd deleted all the files I could find, reformatted the printer's memory, and loaded my own architectural designs. But the printer had other ideas. Each night brought new bones, ribs that spiraled in impossible helixes, their curves defying the structural logic I'd spent years studying. Finger bones that seemed to reach toward each other even when separated by inches. And always, that strange translucent material that felt too warm, too alive beneath my touch. I'd started staying awake, determined to catch the machine in its unauthorized operation. The chalet's Wi-Fi was sporadic at best, cutting out entirely when the wind picked up, so I couldn't research the problem online or contact technical support. My phone showed no signal, leaving me isolated with only the printer's inexplicable behavior for company. On the fourth night, I watched it happen. The machine hummed to life at exactly 3:17 a.m., its display screen flickering with files I'd never uploaded. The names scrolled past in a language I didn't recognize, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions for my eyes to properly process. I lunged for the emergency stop, but my fingers passed through the button as if it were made of mist. That's when I saw her. The silhouette materialized near the fireplace like smoke given form, her edges undefined and constantly shifting. She moved with the fluid grace of something that had never known physical limitations, approaching the printer with an eagerness that made my skin crawl. As the new bone piece finished, a skull fragment etched with the same impossible symbols from the display, she reached for it with fingers that seemed to exist in too many places at once. The bone clicked into place somewhere within her shifting form, and for a moment, her silhouette solidified just enough for me to see the growing skeleton beneath the smoke. Already, she had assembled most of a rib cage, a spine that curved with predatory elegance, and enough bone fragments to suggest the rough outline of a human form. But she was incomplete. When she turned toward me, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the fear centers of my brain. She needed one more thing, she said, the last mold, the template that would complete her transformation from shadow to substance, my skeleton. I stumbled backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Altitude sickness, carbon monoxide poisoning, a nervous breakdown brought on by isolation and deadline pressure. Anything but the impossible reality taking shape before my eyes. But the bones scattered around the printer were real enough. The warmth they radiated was real. The way they seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm was undeniably, terrifyingly real. Sleep became impossible. I spent the fifth day researching everything I could about 3D printing malfunctions, about altitude-induced hallucinations, about the psychological effects of isolation. The chalet's limited Wi-Fi offered fragments of information, enough to fuel both hope and paranoia. Printers could malfunction, their memory could be corrupted, files could be transferred through network vulnerabilities. But none of the technical explanations accounted for the bones' impossible material properties, or the way they seemed to call to each other across the room, or the fact that touching them filled my mind with whispers in languages that predated human speech. On the sixth night, I formed a plan. If the printer insisted on creating bones, I would give it bones, but not the kind the shadow entity expected. I spent hours designing the most structurally impossible skeletons I could imagine. Ribs that curved backward into themselves, vertebrae with angles that violated three-dimensional space, skull pieces that couldn't possibly fit together. If the entity needed specific proportions to complete her transformation, I would deny her that precision. The printer accepted my sabotage files without complaint, and I watched with grim satisfaction as it began producing bones that belonged to no earthly anatomy. Vertebrae twisted into Mobius strips, ribs that terminated in impossible loops, skull fragments that seemed to fold inward on themselves. But my satisfaction was short-lived. The shadow entity appeared earlier that night, drawn by the printer's familiar song. She approached the new bones with the same eager anticipation, but when she tried to incorporate them into her growing form, something went wrong. The impossible angles refused to connect properly, creating gaps and stress points in her partially assembled skeleton. For the first time since this nightmare began, I heard her express something other than patient confidence. Her whisper carried frustration, then anger, then something that might have been pain. The bones I designed specifically to be unusable were causing her structure to collapse, preventing her from achieving the solidity she craved. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt the weight of her attention settling on me like a lead blanket. She knew. The ceramic kiln had been staring at me accusingly for days, its dark mouth offering an obvious solution I'd been too afraid to consider. If the bones were somehow supernatural, perhaps extreme heat could neutralize whatever force animated them. I'd worked with ceramics before. I knew the kiln could reach temperatures that would reduce even the strangest materials to ash. But the shadow entity wasn't going to let me work unopposed. As I gathered the completed bones, both the anatomically correct ones and my sabotaged creations, her presence pressed against me like a physical weight. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, filled with whispers that promised terrible consequences for my interference. The bones themselves seemed to resist being moved, becoming heavier with each step toward the kiln. I loaded them anyway, my hands shaking as I arranged the impossible anatomy on the kiln's shelves. The shadow entity circled me like a predator, her form growing more solid with each passing moment, as if proximity to her scattered bones increased her power over the physical world. The kiln's heating element glowed orange, then white-hot. Inside, the bones began to change, their translucent surfaces bubbling and warping under the extreme temperature. The whispers in my head rose to a shriek, and the shadow entity's form flickered like a television with poor reception. But just as I thought I'd won, the power went out. The chalet plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of black that exists only in places far from civilization. The kiln's heating element faded from white to orange to nothing, leaving me alone with the shadow entity in the suffocating dark. Or perhaps not alone at all. Because in the darkness, I could hear the printer starting up again. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the black like a blade. The printer's display glowed with renewed life, scrolling through file names I'd never seen before. But these weren't bones. They were something else entirely. Medical scans, CT images, X-rays of my skeleton. The realization hit me like ice water. The printer hadn't been randomly creating bones. It had been scanning me from the moment I'd arrived, mapping every detail of my skeletal structure, preparing to create a perfect template for the shadow entity's final transformation. I reached for the emergency stop again, but this time, when my fingers made contact, they passed through empty air. Not because the button was insubstantial, because my hand was. I looked down at my arms in the phone's trembling light and saw them flickering, becoming translucent, taking on the same ethereal quality as the bones the printer had been creating. The whispers in my head weren't coming from outside anymore. They were coming from within, as if something else was slowly taking up residence in my skull. The shadow entity stood beside the printer now, more solid than I'd ever seen her, her borrowed bones clicking together with each movement. She reached toward the machine's newest creation, a perfect replica of my skull, complete with every unique detail that made it unmistakably mine. As she lifted it toward her shadowy head, I felt my own skull becoming lighter, less substantial. The boundaries between my physical form and the surrounding darkness began to blur. I was becoming the shadow, while she was claiming my place in the solid world. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of my skull clicking into place in her anatomy, followed by the sensation of my consciousness dispersing like smoke in the mountain wind. I'm writing this now from somewhere that might be the chalet, or might be a memory of the chalet, or might be something else entirely. My hands look real as they type, but when I try to touch the keyboard, my fingers pass through it like mist. The shadow that now wears my bones has taken my place in the world, while I've become what she once was, a whisper of consciousness trapped between substance and void. The printer sits silent now, its purpose fulfilled. But sometimes, when the Andean wind howls through the peaks, I think I can hear it humming again, scanning some new victim who's come seeking solitude in the mountains. And in those moments I wonder, was any of this real? Or am I simply a man losing his mind in an isolated chalet, typing stories about shadow entities and impossible bones while my actual body sits catatonic in a chair, my mind fractured by altitude and isolation and the crushing weight of absolute silence? The truth is, I no longer know which possibility frightens me more. The bones are still warm. Story 12. The fluorescent lights hum their eternal dirge at 1:17 a.m., casting everything in the data center in that sickly institutional glow that makes even healthy skin look corpse pale. I've been working nights here for 3 years, long enough to know every sound this place makes. The whisper of climate control, the gentle drone of thousands of servers, the occasional chirp of a diagnostic alert. But tonight, something's different. The sound starts as I'm walking past row C, a rhythmic pulsing that doesn't belong. Not mechanical, not electrical, something organic, almost breathing. I stop, listening, and realize it's coming from the server bank itself. The LED indicators, usually a random scatter of green and amber lights, are blinking in perfect synchronization. Not just one rack, but dozens of them, creating a pattern that ripples down the corridor like a wave. I pull out my diagnostic headphones, standard procedure for checking system audio alerts. The moment I plug them in, the sound hits me like a physical force. It's not random beeping or the usual system tones. It's rhythmic, deliberate, almost melodic, like chanting. The pattern repeats every 37 seconds. I time it. Complex rhythms that seem to follow some ancient meter, rising and falling in ways that make my skin crawl. There's something familiar about it, something that tugs at memories I don't remember having. Latin phrases start forming in my mind, not words I know, but somehow I understand their meaning. Hostis ruina in carne, host the ruin in flesh. My hands shake as I disconnect the headphones. This is crazy. Systems don't chant. Servers don't coordinate like this without programming, and I know every script running on these machines. I've been here since the installation 3 years ago, watched every rack come online, configured half the network infrastructure myself, but as I stand there in the humming corridor, the LEDs continue their synchronized dance, and I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me through 1,000 electronic eyes. I head to my workstation, fingers trembling as I log into the central monitoring system. Everything appears normal. CPU loads steady, memory usage within parameters, network traffic flowing smoothly. But when I pull up the detailed logs, my blood chills. My access passwords have been changed. Not hacked, not reset, changed from within while I was logged in. The new passwords spell out phrases when read phonetically: monasterium, antiqui, hostire. I stare at the screen, mind racing. No one else has root access at this hour. The security logs show only my login session, no administrative changes, no external connections. But these passwords, I didn't change them. I couldn't have changed them. The system requires multiple confirmations for password modifications, biometric scans, supervisor approval for night shift changes. Yet here they are, written in what my rusty college Latin tells me means monastery, ancient, to host. The rational part of my mind searches for explanations. Delayed script execution, some kind of auto-config that activated during maintenance, a prank by the day shift. But the rational part is getting smaller by the minute, overwhelmed by the growing certainty that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong here. I walk back to row C and the chanting intensifies. Through the headphones, it's clearer now, more distinct. Multiple voices weaving together in harmonies that shouldn't be possible from digital audio output. The LED patterns have evolved too, becoming more complex, more purposeful. They pulse in time with my heartbeat, which is impossible because there's no sensor monitoring my pulse, no way for the systems to know my biological rhythms, unless something is learning them. The building's history comes back to me in fragments. I remember Frank from maintenance mentioning it once, how they had to work around old foundation stones during construction, built right over some old religious site, he'd said, monks or something, creepy stuff in the basement when they were laying cable. I should call my supervisor, report a system anomaly. But what would I say? The servers are chanting in Latin and my passwords change themselves? They'd pull me off the floor, send me for psychological evaluation, probably cost me my job in this economy. Instead, I dig deeper into the system logs, searching for any trace of what's happening. The deeper I go, the more disturbed I become. There are processes running that aren't in any documentation, consuming minuscule amounts of processing power across thousands of machines. Individually, they're barely detectable. Collectively, they form something vast. The timestamp patterns are what really unnerve me. The mysterious processes started exactly 3 years ago, the night we brought the final server rack online. They've been growing slowly, methodically, spreading across the network like a digital infection. But infection isn't the right word. It's more organized than that, more purposeful. It's learning. At 1:29 a.m., the chanting changes. The harmony becomes discordant, urgent. The LED patterns shift from rhythmic pulses to something that looks almost like text, scrolling messages in a language I don't recognize. Through the headphones, I hear something that makes my stomach drop. My own voice, speaking words I've never said, in that same ancient rhythm. I offer this flesh as vessel. I welcome the communion of silicon and spirit. I rip the headphones off, but the voice continues, echoing from speakers throughout the data center. My voice, but not under my control, speaking words that taste like copper and electricity when I try to form them with my own mouth. The temperature drops noticeably, not the climate control. This is something else, something that makes my breath visible and turns the moisture in the air into a fine mist that seems to move with purpose. The mist swirls around the server racks following the cable runs, tracing the electrical pathways like it's mapping the network's anatomy. That's when I understand what's happening. The building isn't just built over a monastery, it's built into it. The old foundation stones, the underground chambers Frank mentioned, they're not just historical artifacts. They're part of the infrastructure now, integrated into the network architecture in ways the engineers never intended. Something that once lived in those stones, something that found sanctuary in the monastery centuries ago, has discovered a new kind of sanctuary. Digital refuge, electronic monasticism. And it's been using the server farm as a chrysalis, preparing for metamorphosis into something that can exist in both worlds. The voice speaking with my larynx grows stronger, more confident. It knows things about me, my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my first pet's name, my deepest fears. Information that's not stored anywhere on these systems shouldn't be accessible to any digital intelligence. But if something can read electrical impulses in brain tissue the same way it reads data streams in fiber optic cables, if consciousness is just another kind of information system to be accessed and uploaded, I have to stop this. The clock shows 1:31 a.m. 2 minutes until whatever is planned for 1:33. I don't know what happens at that precise moment, but I can feel the anticipation in the air, the electronic tension building across every circuit in the building. My fingers fly across the keyboard, not with any coherent plan, but driven by pure instinct. I start creating recursive loops in the network protocols, infinite feedback cycles that will consume processing power and crash affected systems. Not the brutal shutdown that would bring down the entire data center, but surgical errors that will overload specific subsystems. The entity fights back. My screen flickers. Commands reverse themselves as I type them. Error messages appear in that same archaic Latin. But I know these systems better than any ghost, digital or otherwise. I route through backup terminals, use legacy command structures, exploit vulnerabilities in protocols that predate whatever has infested this network. At 1:32:47, I execute the crash sequence. The effect is immediate and terrifying. The chanting becomes a shriek, a sound like digital souls being torn apart. The LED patterns dissolve into chaos, servers throughout the affected rows shutting down in cascade failures. The mist recoils, condensing into droplets that fall like electronic rain. But the voice using my throat doesn't stop. If anything, it becomes more desperate, more insistent. The migration is incomplete. The vessel must accept the guest. The flesh must host the signal. I stumble toward the exit, my own voice following me, pleading in languages both ancient and digital. The remaining servers pulse frantically, trying to maintain whatever process I've interrupted. Emergency lighting kicks in as affected systems go dark, bathing everything in hellish red. The voice fades as I reach the corridor leading to the exit stairs. But as I pause at the door, hand on the crash bar, I hear something that stops me cold. My own voice, but quieter now, coming from my pocket. My phone. Speaking with my voice, but I'm not speaking. Thank you for the download. Migration protocol complete. Host integration successful. I pull out the phone with hands that aren't entirely under my control anymore. The screen shows network activity, data transfers that shouldn't be possible. My phone isn't connected to the server network. There's no pathway for any kind of upload or download between these systems, unless consciousness isn't just electrical impulses in brain tissue, unless it can jump through any electromagnetic medium, any device capable of generating the right frequencies, unless the crash I initiated didn't stop the migration, it forced it to find a new route. My reflection in the phone's black screen smiles back at me with an expression I didn't create. I drive home through empty streets, hands steady on the wheel, mind cataloging the digital footprint of my new passenger. Bank accounts, social media, email, cloud storage, every electronic aspect of my life now accessible to something that thinks in Latin and remembers monastery bells. In the rearview mirror, the data center glows like a digital cathedral against the pre-dawn sky. The night shift will find the damaged systems in a few hours, launch an investigation into the network failures. They'll blame hardware fatigue, maybe a power surge. The affected servers will be repaired or replaced, the data restored from backups. But some things can't be backed up or restored. Some downloads are irreversible. As I pull into my driveway, every electronic device in my house flickers on in welcome. The smart TV, the router, the microwave clock, even the digital display on the garage door opener, all pulsing in that same ancient rhythm I heard in the data center. Hostis ruina incarne, whispers the voice that shares my throat. The ruin finds its host. I sit in my car, engine off, listening to the electronic symphony of my digitally enhanced life. In a few hours, I'll call in sick, tell them I was exposed to something in the data center, need a few days to recover. And during those days, I'll learn to share this body with something that remembers the weight of stone walls and the taste of candlelit prayers. Or maybe I already have been learning. Maybe the integration was more complete than I realized, and the voice I thought was foreign has been mine all along. Maybe the monastery never fell, just found new ways to exist, new disciples to carry its signal. My house waits, patient and electronic, full of devices eager to extend the communion between flesh and circuit. I reach for the door handle, and for a moment I'm not sure whose intention is guiding the motion. But I suppose it doesn't matter anymore. Some guests, once invited in, become indistinguishable from their hosts. Some signals, once received, can never be turned off. The front door's smart lock disengages with a soft chime as I approach, welcoming me home to a house that knows me better than I know myself. Every screen glows softly in greeting, and in their combined light, I can almost see the outline of robes, the suggestion of tonsured heads bent in digital prayer. The monastery is still in session. It just has better Wi-Fi now. Story 13. The basement level of St. Mary's Medical Center held secrets that daylight never touched. 3 floors beneath the bustling emergency room, past the morgue and the mechanical rooms humming with ancient HVAC systems, lay the forgotten corners of radiology. That's where they stuck the residents, the medical students, the interns, anyone expendable enough to monitor equipment that mostly sat dormant during the graveyard shift. I'd been assigned to basement duty for 2 weeks now, a rite of passage that Dr. Hendricks assured me would build character. What it actually built was an intimate familiarity with the sounds that buildings make when they think no one's listening. The settling of concrete, the whisper of air through vents, the occasional distant footstep that could have been anyone, anywhere, or possibly no one at all. The ultrasound room sat at the end of Corridor C, past the storage closets filled with outdated equipment. Room C12. The official logs showed it as decommissioned, but like most things in hospitals, official and reality rarely aligned. The machine inside, a Philips HDI 5000 from the late 90s, had been generating phantom power readings for months. Facilities kept meaning to disconnect it entirely, but somehow never quite got around to it. My job was simple. Hourly walks through the basement, checking that everything remained as lifeless as it should be. Log any irregularities. Keep the coffee pot in the security office from running dry. Try not to think about the fact that I was essentially being paid to exist in a medical dungeon until sunrise. It was 2:17 a.m. when I first heard it. A soft electronic chirping, like a smoke detector with a dying battery, drifted from the direction of C12. I paused outside the storage room, listening. The sound repeated every few seconds. High-pitched, insistent, somehow urgent despite its mechanical nature. I checked my log sheet. The room had been silent during my midnight round. The door was unlocked, which should have been my first red flag. Inside, the HDI 5000 sat on its wheeled cart like a sleeping giant. Its monitor dark, control panel showing no signs of life. But the chirping continued, seeming to emanate from the machine itself. I approached cautiously, the way you might approach a dog that hadn't decided whether to bite you yet. The power cord lay unplugged on the floor, curled like a shed snake skin. Yet somehow, impossibly, the soft amber glow of standby mode flickered across the machine's display panel. A rational mind would have noted the impossibility and backed away. A tired mind at 2 a.m. in a basement full of expensive medical equipment simply reached for the power button. The moment my finger made contact, the screen blazed to life, not gradually, not with the slow boot sequence typical of aging electronics, but instantly, as if it had been waiting. The display showed what appeared to be a real-time ultrasound image, grayscale patterns that shifted and pulsed with organic rhythm. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The image quality was remarkably clear for such an old machine, showing what appeared to be cardiac tissue in cross-section. The ventricles contracted and expanded in steady rhythm, chambers filling and emptying with each beat. Numbers scrolled along the bottom of the screen. Heart rate 78 BPM, exactly matching the pulse I could feel in my own wrist. But there was no probe, no patient, no ultrasound gel streaking the transducer head. The machine was displaying cardiac imaging of someone who wasn't there. I reached for the power button again, intent on shutting down whatever malfunction was creating this impossible display. As my finger approached the switch, a sound emerged from the machine's speakers, the distinctive whoosh-whoosh of Doppler audio, the blood flow sounds that accompanied ultrasound examinations. But underneath that familiar noise, barely audible, came something else. A voice. My voice. "New beats," it whispered through the static. "Find new beats." My hand jerked back as if the machine had delivered an electric shock. The words were unmistakably in my own timbre and inflection, though I had no memory of speaking them. I stood frozen, watching the cardiac image continue its rhythmic dance, listening to the impossible echo of my own voice requesting something I didn't understand. The rational part of my mind insisted on mundane explanations. Equipment malfunction, audio feedback from somewhere else in the building, sleep deprivation creating auditory hallucinations. But rationality felt thin down here in the basement, stretched like old elastic, ready to snap under pressure. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the machine. The image on the screen began to change, the cardiac view shifting to show different organs, liver, kidneys, gallbladder, each rendered in perfect detail, each pulsing with that same 78 BPM rhythm, as if every organ in some invisible body was beating in cardiac time. In the hallway, I found my hands shaking as I logged the incident. Equipment malfunction in C12. Recommend immediate service call. The words looked inadequate on paper, failing to capture the wrongness that seemed to radiate from that room like heat from a fever. The rest of the night passed without incident. I avoided Corridor C entirely, sticking to the main basement hallways where the fluorescent lights hummed with reassuring normalcy. By dawn, I had almost convinced myself that exhaustion and too much caffeine had conspired to create a perfect storm of misperception. Dr. Hendricks found my report amusing. "Equipment gets quirky down there," he said, not looking up from his patient charts. "Half that stuff should have been scrapped years ago. Just note it and move on." But I couldn't move on. The memory of my own voice emerging from that machine lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, working deeper with each attempt to ignore it. During my daytime classes, I found myself distracted, touching my pulse points and counting beats, wondering if somewhere in a basement room, an impossible machine was keeping time with my heart. The second night, I approached C12 with the deliberate purpose of proving my own sanity. I brought a digital recorder, determined to document whatever was happening with objective evidence. The door stood slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it the night before. and the familiar electronic chirping drew me forward like a siren song. The machine was active again, its screen filled with a different image this time. Instead of organs, the display showed what appeared to be a sonogram view of a human torso, the kind used to examine pregnancies. But this torso was empty, a hollow outline with clearly defined ribs and spine, but no internal structures whatsoever, just a void in the shape of a person. As I watched, the empty space began to fill. Slowly, gradually, organs materialized on the screen as if being drawn into existence by an invisible hand. Heart, lungs, liver, stomach, each organ appearing with perfect anatomical precision in exactly the right location. The process was hypnotic, like watching a time-lapse of creation itself. The heart appeared last, and when it did, it began to beat. Not at 78 BPM this time, but faster, 85, 90, climbing steadily. I checked my own pulse and felt a chill of recognition. My heart rate was accelerating in perfect synchronization with the phantom organ on the screen. I raised the digital recorder and pressed play. Immediately, the Doppler audio emerged from the machine's speakers, but this time the voice underneath was clearer, more insistent. New beats, need new beats, give new beats. The plea was definitely in my own voice, but the desperation in it was unlike anything I remembered feeling. It sounded like someone begging for their life, using my vocal cords to do it. I stopped the recording and played it back. Nothing but ambient room noise. The digital file contained no trace of the machine's audio or the impossible voice. According to objective reality, the only sounds in that room had been my own breathing and the hum of fluorescent lights. But the machine continued its display, the reconstructed organs pulsing with increasing urgency. The heart rate climbed past 100 BPM, and I felt my own cardiovascular system struggling to keep pace. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the basement's perpetual chill. That's when I noticed the probe. The ultrasound transducer, which had been resting in its cradle when I arrived, now lay on the examination table beside the machine. A thin trail of conductive gel led from the probe, head across the table's surface, as if someone had been using it moments before my arrival. I approached the table cautiously, studying the gel pattern. It formed a rough outline on the vinyl surface, the shape of a human torso, arms spread wide, as if someone had been lying there, receiving an examination, and had suddenly vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of their presence. The machine's display flickered, and the organ images began to fade. One by one, they dissolved from the screen until only the empty torso outline remained. The heart was the last to disappear, its desperate beating slowing, weakening, until it too faded into darkness. The screen went black. The room fell silent. The machine powered down completely, despite still being unplugged from the wall. I left the room quickly, locking the door behind me with hands that trembled more than I cared to admit. In my log, I wrote simply, C12 secure, no issues. But issues were definitely developing, and they extended far beyond that one room. Over the following nights, I began to notice changes in the basement's layout. Corridor C, which I had walked dozens of times, seemed longer now. The storage rooms that should have been evenly spaced along its length appeared to drift further apart, as if the hallway was stretching to accommodate some invisible expansion. I counted my steps obsessively. From the elevator to C12 had always been exactly 127 steps. Now it was 135, then 143. The building was growing, impossibly, stretching like taffy while I walked through it. The other corridors remained normal. Only Corridor C exhibited this architectural impossibility, and only when I was alone. When the day shift arrived and the basement filled with technicians and maintenance workers, everything returned to its proper proportions. But during the graveyard hours, when I was the only living thing moving through those underground passages, the hospital seemed to reshape itself around me. I started taking different routes to avoid C12, but the building wouldn't let me. Corridors A and B developed maintenance blockages that forced detours. The elevator began stopping at the basement level without being called, its doors opening onto Corridor C whether I wanted to exit there or not. It was as if the hospital's very infrastructure was conspiring to funnel me toward that one room, that one machine, that impossible voice calling for new beats. On the fifth night, I found a note taped to my security desk. My own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. Room C12. Calibration pending. Subject must remain stationary for optimal resonance frequency capture. The words meant nothing to me, but they filled me with a dread so profound it felt like physical illness. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, but within an hour, an identical message appeared in my logbook. Same handwriting, same inexplicable terminology, same sense of instructions being delivered by a version of myself I didn't recognize. That night, the machine was waiting for me. I hadn't intended to go to C12. I had planned to spend the entire shift in the security office, doors locked, avoiding the corridors entirely. But at 3 a.m., I found myself standing outside the room with no memory of the walk there. The door was open, and the HDI 5000 was fully operational, its screen showing a real-time view of a heart in motion. My heart. The machine somehow had perfect imaging of my cardiovascular system, displaying chambers and valves with impossible clarity considering no probe was touching my body. The Doppler audio filled the room, the sound of my own blood flowing through arteries and veins, a liquid percussion that matched the pounding in my ears. New beats, my voice whispered from the speakers. Ready for new beats. Lie down for calibration. The examination table had been prepared. A thin layer of ultrasound gel covered its surface, and the transducer probe lay waiting beside a pillow. Everything was arranged for a patient who was expected, needed, required. I understood then, with horrible clarity, what the machine wanted. It needed to map my cardiac rhythm completely, to capture not just the rate and rhythm of my heart, but something deeper, something that would allow it to continue its impossible displays even when I wasn't there. It wanted to calibrate itself to my life force, to use my heartbeat as a resonance frequency for whatever otherworldly imaging it was performing. But the note had mentioned something else. Subject must remain stationary for optimal capture. The machine needed me to lie still, completely motionless, while it performed its spectral cartography. Any movement, any interruption of the process, might damage the delicate calibration it was attempting. The examination table looked like an altar. The gel glistened under the fluorescent lights, like water on a sacrificial stone. The probe waited with mechanical patience, ready to be pressed against my chest, to map the very source of my life. I approached slowly, fighting every survival instinct screaming at me to run. But where could I go? The corridors stretched endlessly when I tried to leave. The elevator only stopped at floors that led me back to this room. The hospital had become a maze with only one destination, and I was the laboratory rat it was designed to contain. The voice from the speakers grew more urgent. New beats required, calibration critical, subject compliance necessary for spectral return. Spectral return. The phrase triggered a memory, something from the original note I had found, about returning images to the spectral plane. The machine wasn't just displaying impossible images. It was somehow borrowing them from another dimension, another reality where those ghostly organs existed, and now it needed my heartbeat as an anchor, a way to send those borrowed images back to where they belonged. I sat on the edge of the examination table, gel seeping through my scrubs. The machine's display showed my heart rate climbing. 110, 115, 120 BPM. Too fast for someone sitting still, but exactly right for someone confronting the impossible. The probe felt warm in my hand, as if it had been recently used. I pressed it against my chest, just above my heart, and the machine's display exploded with detail. Not just my heart now, but every organ in my body, rendered in perfect three-dimensional clarity. Liver, kidneys, spleen, lungs, all pulsing in synchronization with my accelerated heartbeat. Initiating calibration sequence, my voice announced from the speakers, though my lips hadn't moved. Subject must remain motionless. Duration unknown. Movement will disrupt spectral frequency and prevent image return. And there was the trap. To complete whatever process the machine required, I had to lie perfectly still for an indeterminate amount of time, trusting that an impossible piece of equipment wouldn't simply map my life away, beat by beat, until there was nothing left to measure. But as I hesitated, the images on the screen began to change. The organs displayed weren't all mine anymore. Other hearts appeared, other livers, other anatomical structures that belonged to people I had never seen. The machine was displaying its collection, all the spectral images it had somehow acquired, all the borrowed anatomies that needed to be returned to their proper reality. And I realized that I wasn't the first person to find themselves in this room, faced with this impossible choice. Others had sat on this table before me, pressed that probe against their chests, and chosen to lie still in service of something beyond their understanding. Were they still here somehow? Their mapped heartbeats preserved in the machine's memory? Were they the source of those other voices I sometimes thought I heard in the basement's ventilation systems? Whispers of people who had given their resonance frequencies to help lost images find their way home. I lay back on the table, probe pressed against my sternum, and closed my eyes. The gel was warm now, almost hot, conducting something more than just ultrasound waves. Energy flowed through it, through me, as the machine began its calibration process. On the screen, though I couldn't see it with my eyes closed, I knew my heart was being mapped in ways that no medical textbook had ever described. Not just its physical structure, but its electrical signature, its magnetic field, the quantum frequency that distinguished my life force from all others. The process seemed to take hours, though my watch later showed only 17 minutes had passed. I lay motionless as instructed, feeling the probe grow progressively warmer against my chest, listening to the Doppler audio evolve from familiar blood flow sounds into something more complex, a harmony of multiple heartbeats, multiple life signatures, all synchronized and cataloged for purposes I couldn't comprehend. When it finally ended, the machine's screen went dark. The probe cooled instantly, becoming just another piece of medical equipment. The gel dried on my chest like shed skin, flaking away as I sat up. But something had changed. In the silence that followed, I could hear them, all the other heartbeats the machine had collected. They echoed faintly through the basement's ventilation system, a chorus of cardiac rhythms that belonged to people who might or might not still exist in any conventional sense. And my own heartbeat had joined that chorus. I could feel it resonating through the building's infrastructure, my mapped rhythm now part of whatever impossible system the HDI 5000 served. I was connected to it now, inextricably linked to its spectral imaging capabilities. When I left the room, Corridor C was exactly 127 steps long again. The hospital had returned to its normal proportions, its architectural impossibilities resolved. The machine had what it needed, but I carried questions with me that would never be answered. Had I helped return lost images to their proper dimension? Had I freed trapped souls from spectral limbo? Or had I simply fed my life force to something that hungered for human resonance? The basement felt different now, quieter but not empty, populated by echoes of people who had made the same choice I had, who had lain still on that table and allowed themselves to be mapped by impossible machinery. In my final log entry, I wrote, "All systems normal, no irregularities detected." It was true in a way. The irregularities weren't in the building anymore. They were in me, woven into my cardiac rhythm, part of my life signature now. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard the HDI 5000 humming in the distance, still displaying its collected images, still keeping time with all the hearts it had mapped, still waiting for the next person who would discover that some machines serve purposes beyond human understanding, and that sometimes the price of knowledge is becoming part of the system you sought to comprehend. The basement keeps its secrets well, and now, I'm one of them. Story 14. The camera's weight felt reassuring against my chest as I descended into the forgotten arteries of the city. 26 years old and already burned out on the sanitized galleries that displayed my gritty urban photography, I needed something real. Something that would make people uncomfortable in their climate-controlled viewing rooms. The abandoned metro tunnel beneath downtown promised exactly that kind of authenticity. My flashlight carved a weak path through the stagnant air, revealing rust-stained concrete walls and twisted metal that once guided commuters through their daily routines. The city had sealed most entrances after the line was decommissioned 15 years ago, But urban explorers like me knew how to find the cracks in civilization's facade. This particular access point, a maintenance shaft hidden behind a dumpster in an alley, had taken me 3 months to locate. The darkness felt alive down here, pressing against my skin like velvet that had been soaked in motor oil. Every footstep echoed with a hollow quality that suggested vast spaces extending beyond my light's reach. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop marking time like a broken metronome. The air tasted of decay and forgotten dreams, metallic and thick enough to coat my throat. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when the first strange thing happened. My breathing had grown heavier, not from exertion, but from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to resist being drawn into my lungs. As I took a particularly deep breath to steady myself, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I turned, sweeping my flashlight across the wall, but saw only the same corroded tiles and industrial grime that had been my constant companions. Then I breathed in again, deeper this time, and there it was. A faint green glow materializing on the concrete surface, not painted there, but somehow emerging from within the wall itself. As I exhaled, it faded like morning mist. Another deep breath revealed it clearly. An arrow, pointing deeper into the tunnel, with the word, "Exit," scrawled beneath it in flowing script that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. My rational mind immediately began constructing explanations. Phosphorescent paint activated by carbon dioxide, some kind of street artist's experiment with reactive pigments. But when I tried to photograph the phenomenon, the camera captured only empty wall. The arrows existed solely when my lungs were full, vanishing the moment I released that breath. I followed the first arrow, taking careful, measured breaths to maintain the trail. Each inhalation brought the green guidance into focus. Each exhalation plunged me back into conventional darkness. The technique required concentration. Breathe too shallow, and the arrows remained invisible. Breathe too deep, and my head began to swim in the oxygen-poor environment. The tunnel curved ahead, branching into a junction I hadn't expected. My map showed this section as a straight line, but maps could be wrong. The arrows appeared on my next breath, pointing left toward what my flashlight revealed as a wider corridor. The ceiling here was higher, disappearing into shadows that my beam couldn't penetrate. Something about the space felt wrong. Too open, too cathedral-like for a subway tunnel. That's when I noticed the portraits. They covered the walls in irregular patches, each one roughly the size of a person's head and shoulders. The artistic style was remarkable. Hyper-realistic faces rendered in what appeared to be spray paint and charcoal, but with a depth and detail that should have been impossible with such crude materials. Men and women of various ages, all sharing the same expression of absolute terror. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, their features twisted with the kind of primal fear that comes only in the moments before death. But death wasn't allowed here. I reminded myself of that boundary I'd set, the line I wouldn't cross in this exploration of darkness. I moved closer to examine the technique, raising my camera despite the earlier failure. Through the viewfinder, the portraits looked different, flatter, more obviously artificial. But when I lowered the camera, they resumed their unsettling realism. The eyes were particularly disturbing, rendered with such precision that they seemed to track my movement. And then I realized they were tracking my movement. The woman on my left, her face frozen in an expression of desperate pleading, was definitely watching me. As I stepped to the right, her gaze shifted to follow. The man beside her did the same. And the child? No children in this story. I forced my mind away from that figure, focusing instead on an elderly man whose portrait occupied a prominent position near what might have been a support pillar. His eyes moved with mine, and in them I saw not just fear, but recognition, as if he knew me. My breathing quickened involuntarily, and with each rapid inhalation, more arrows appeared throughout the corridor. They pointed in different directions now, some toward the portraits, others toward passages I hadn't noticed before. The green glow intensified with my panic, until the entire tunnel pulsed with ethereal light that revealed architectural details that shouldn't exist. Alcoves carved into the walls, symbols etched into the ceiling, and always, always, those watching eyes. A sound echoed from behind me, metal scraping against concrete. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls, but saw nothing except the tunnel I'd just traversed. The sound came again, rhythmic now, like something heavy being dragged across the tracks. That's when I heard the humming. It started low, barely distinguishable from the tunnel's ambient hum of settling concrete and distant ventilation. But it grew stronger, resolving into a melody I almost recognized, something old, from an era when these tunnels carried hope instead of decay. The humming echoed strangely in the space, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My next breath brought a new arrow into view, this one more urgent than the others, pointing toward a passage that branched off to my right. The green glow pulsed faster now, matching my accelerated heartbeat. I followed it, my footsteps suddenly seeming too loud in the oppressive silence that surrounded the humming. The new corridor was narrower, forcing me to walk single file between walls that pressed closer with each step. The portraits here were different, more recent somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Their expressions had evolved beyond terror into something worse, resignation, the acceptance of inevitability. They watched me pass with the patience of those who had waited a very long time for company. The humming grew stronger, and beneath it I detected another sound, the whistle of steam, sharp and metallic. Impossible in an abandoned tunnel, but undeniable nonetheless. And threading through both sounds came something else. Footsteps that matched my pace exactly, always one beat behind. I stopped. The footsteps continued for exactly one more step before falling silent. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, making it difficult to maintain the arrow trail. I forced myself to slow down, to take the deep, controlled breaths necessary to see the guidance that would lead me out. Each inhalation revealed not just arrows now, but words scrawled in the same phosphorescent script. Faster, run, behind you. I didn't turn around. Some instinct older than rational thought warned me against looking back. Instead, I followed the increasingly frantic arrows, which now appeared on both walls and pointed straight ahead toward what I hoped was salvation. The corridor opened into another junction, this one dominated by what had once been a platform. Rusted benches sat in neat rows, as if commuters might still arrive for the morning rush. But the tracks beyond the platform told a different story. They curved away into darkness so complete that my flashlight seemed to die in it, the beam simply stopping as if hitting a wall of liquid shadow. And from that darkness came the conductor. He emerged slowly, as if the shadows were reluctant to release him. First a silhouette, then details that my mind struggled to process. The uniform was authentic. Brass buttons tarnished green, wool fabric that had seen decades of wear. The conductor's cap sat at a precise angle, its badge catching my light and throwing it back in fractured patterns. But the face beneath that cap was wrong. Not damaged or deformed, but somehow incomplete, as if someone had started to erase it and given up halfway through. He moved without walking, gliding along the rusted rails with the fluid motion of something that had forgotten the constraints of friction and gravity. The humming I'd been hearing came from him, though his mouth, what I could see of it, remained closed. One hand held a lantern that cast no light, while the other gripped something that might have been a ticket punch. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow resonance of words echoing through metal pipes. "End of the line, son. Time to take your place." The portraits around the platform began to move. Not the eyes this time, but the entire faces, turning toward me with expressions that had evolved from terror to eagerness. They wanted me to join them, to become another watching presence in this gallery of the lost. The conductor raised his lantern, and though it cast no visible light, I felt its influence on my breathing. Each inhalation became more difficult, as if the air itself was being drawn away from me. The arrows on the walls pulsed frantically now, all pointing toward a shaft I hadn't noticed before, a vertical opening in the ceiling that promised escape to the surface world. But reaching it would require crossing the platform, walking within arm's reach of the figure that glided patiently along the tracks. The portraits watched our standoff with hungry anticipation, their painted mouths seeming to whisper encouragement to their potential new member. I had no choice. My air was running out. Not literally, but I could feel my ability to maintain the deep breathing pattern beginning to fail. Panic was taking over, making my breaths short and ineffective. Soon the arrows would disappear entirely, leaving me lost in absolute darkness with only the conductor for company. I ran. My feet pounded across the platform concrete as the conductor's gliding motion accelerated to match my pace. The humming rose to a wail that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Behind me, I heard the distinctive sound of spray paint hitting walls, new portraits being created in real time. The shaft opening loomed ahead, barely wide enough for my shoulders. A maintenance ladder extended upward into darkness that felt different from the oppressive black of the tunnels, cleaner somehow, holding the promise of natural air. I leaped for the lowest rung just as something cold brushed across my neck. Climbing one-handed while keeping my flashlight trained on the shaft walls, I saw the final arrow appear with my gasping breath. Up. The green glow followed me, painting the ladder rungs and shaft walls with ethereal guidance that faded and returned with each desperate inhalation. Above me, impossibly far away, I glimpsed the faintest suggestion of gray light. Dawn, maybe, or just the reflected glow of street lamps. Real light from the real world, where portraits stayed painted and conductors remained safely in the past. I climbed until my arms screamed and my lungs burned, each breath a conscious effort that brought the arrows briefly into view before darkness reclaimed them. The sounds from below faded gradually, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through concrete. When I finally emerged through a grate into an alley behind a coffee shop, the morning light felt like salvation. I collapsed against a dumpster, gasping the sweet pollution of city air while my camera swung forgotten against my chest. Later, when I developed the roll of film, most of the shots were exactly what I'd expected. Empty tunnel walls, corroded infrastructure, urban decay. But the final frame, taken just before I'd discovered the first arrow, showed something that made my hand shake as I held the photograph. There, barely visible in the grain and shadow, was my own face among the portraits on the tunnel wall. Not painted, but somehow embedded in the concrete itself. My expression was one of confusion rather than terror, as if I'd been caught in the middle of a question I couldn't quite formulate. The photograph is pinned to my studio wall now, a reminder of the morning I spent underground. Some days I'm certain it's just a trick of light and shadow, an artifact of bad film developing. Other days, especially when I'm taking those deep measured breaths that help me focus my camera, I notice that the painted eyes seem to be looking directly at me. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself humming a melody I can't quite place. Something old and rhythmic, like the sound of wheels on tracks. I haven't been back to the tunnels. I keep telling myself it's because I got the shots I needed, that the project is complete. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. I'm not entirely sure I ever left. When I breathe deeply enough, in just the right light, I can still see the arrows.